Marilu Johnson, originally from the Philippines and a mother of 3 young boys, was living in Washington Township, Michigan. She was thriving, cherishing moments with her family, traveling, and staying active. But she had no idea that danger would strike right where she felt most secure. This is her story. I'm also taking you back to a place we've talked about before, in that previous case, Washington Township, Michigan. I don't expect you to remember this location, but it's more than just an upscale area of Michigan. It's known as one of the area's wealthiest communities. This is a place where celebrities buy houses. It's off the beaten path, far outside the city life of places like Detroit, for example. But, in order to get us to Washington Township, Michigan, I have to take you all the way back to March 17, 1957, in Iloilo, Philippines. That's the date and place where Marilu Johnson was born. Iloilo is a city in the heart of the Philippines, located in Southeast Asia. It's known for its cultural and architectural heritage, which dates back to the Spanish colonial period. The city is also home to several national parks, making it a very popular tourist destination. It's also home to vibrant music and art scenes, with many festivals and events all year round. The province has unbelievable islands. They have hidden caves, lagoons, majestic mountains, and waterfalls. Marilu wanted a better life for herself. She truly believed the U.S. offered more opportunities than her home country, so she immigrated to the United States. I couldn't find the exact date, but what I do know is that by 1986, she had met, married, and had a son with a man named James Eric Johnson. He was a photographer who graduated from the University of Illinois, Chicago. They named their first child Jason Irvin Johnson, using the same initials as his father, James Eric Johnson. Then, just 5 years later, in February of 1982, Marilu had yet another son with James. They named him Jared Edward Johnson, again using the same initials as his father and his older brother. And surprise, just 14 months later their third son was born. It was April of 1993, and they named him Jarrell Everett Johnson. He also had the same initials as the other men in the household. Now the Johnsons were a family of 5, living in Detroit by 1994. But only 7 years later, tragedy would strike this family. Marilu's husband James was diagnosed with leukemia, and tragically he passed away. This left her to raise her 3 teenage boys all by herself at only 44 years old. Actually, I think Jarrell was only 10 years old at the time. It was absolutely devastating for the boys and for Marilu. She lost the love of her life, the rock of their family, their provider, but she knew she couldn't slow down. Marilu knew she needed to be there for her boys. Life had to go on. Things had to get done, and her sons needed their mother more than ever. She was working full-time to try to make ends meet, and she still made sure to be there to drop off and pick up her boys from school, cook for them, and take them to all of their extracurricular activities. She was like a super mom, and the boys called her their best friend. They described Marilu as having such a warm heart. She was the sweetest person and just wanted the best for all of them all the time. She handled the difficult challenges she faced with strength and resilience, making her a role model for her boys. There was no time for Marilu to be sorry for herself. Sure, she could grieve, she knew she had to, but she also realized her priority was making sure she gave her sons the best she could. They became her focus. She had no other family in Michigan or the United States for that matter, so they became her entire life. This actually helped her. It helped her heal from the loss of their father. She kept busy so that she didn't have to be alone with her emotions. She was able to connect with another single mom, Gina Gong, and they bonded over raising their kids on their own and being Filipino. They just clicked. They were like 2 peas in a pod. Gina loved Marilu's laugh. Anytime they had free time, the 2 ladies would get together and hang out. Marilu was tiny but mighty. Marilu was only 5 feet 1 inch. People would underestimate her because of her size, but Marilu was a force to be reckoned with. Gina used to joke with her that it was the little ones you had to watch out for. They were both tiny, and the joke was true. Marilu proved that she was small, but could take on just about anything. She had made it this far, coming from a foreign country, making a life for herself in the United States, marrying, giving birth to 3 boys, and then having to overcome the shocking loss of her husband. There wasn't a lot of time for Marilu to focus on herself, not to mention a love life. She had learned to become very independent and definitely wasn't looking to change that. But she was lonely and missed having the companionship of a partner. They say you always find love when you're not looking for it. Well, that was true in this case. It's one of those love stories that sounds like a modern-day fairy tale, but it wasn't that romantic. A nice gentleman named Scott Blanchard. Scott was a complete stranger to Marilu, but he came into her life and everything changed. Before her husband James passed away, the Johnson family was living in an apartment at Stony Park Place Apartments. They're called luxury apartments, and it's a really cute, close-knit neighborhood in Shelby Township. Scott was living in the same apartment complex. He was one of the Johnsons' neighbors and got to know Marilu, her husband James, and their 3 sons very well. He was sad when he found out that James's health was failing. Scott began helping the family out in any way he could. It was small tasks here and there, like taking the boys out for some ice cream when Marilu had to take care of their ill father. And then, when James's condition worsened, Scott stepped up even more. He began taking the boys to their football practices and even their games. He helped with grocery shopping and did anything he could to take some of the burden off of Marilu. She was just so sweet, and he felt like it was the right thing to do. It was the neighborly thing to do. After James passed away, Scott did his best to continue helping out any way that he could, just being a good friend. But Scott had plans for more. Not for him and Marilu, but for Marilu to meet his father, Roger Blanchard. Scott was Roger's youngest son, and at that point Roger had 3 adult children, Gregory, Heather, and Scott. In 2001, Roger was around 66 years old. His children were actually closer to Marilu's age. Scott was around 33 years old at the time and wanted to play matchmaker with his dad and his 44-year-old neighbor, Marilu. He thought that both of them would get along very well. His father was lonely. He had also gone through the death of his wife, and all of his children were grown up. He had no one, and neither did Marilu. So Scott figured, you know what, it's worth a shot. And Marilu was hesitant at first, but it was actually love at first sight for Roger. There was just something about Marilu that made him come alive, and the 22-year age difference didn't matter to either one of them. They just started getting to know each other, connecting here and there, talking on the phone, and keeping in touch. But it was clear that Roger wanted more. He was charming, intelligent, and it didn't hurt that he was very well off. Not just well off, Roger was a multimillionaire, a very successful businessman. Born and raised in 1935 in Detroit, Michigan, Roger was very ambitious. He graduated from Henry Ford Trade School in 1953. The school trained teenage boys in a variety of skills, industrial trade work like machinery, drafting, and engine design, among other things. Roger excelled and went on to expand his studies by receiving a mathematics degree from Michigan Technological University. Roger was a brilliant engineer. He had a number of patents on products he produced for NASA, and his skills landed him a career with a company called Clipper Precision Manufacturing. They handled a lot of mechanical, hydraulic, and electromechanical assembly. I'm pretty sure the name was changed and now this company is called Precision Gear Company. Nevertheless, Roger worked his way up and ended up becoming the president of this company. They specialized in complex aerospace and military industrial manufacturing, things that I know nothing about, but they sound very complicated. At one point, this company was called ACR Industries Incorporated, and Roger ended up purchasing the entire company. It was an aerospace engineering company that made components for aircraft with commercial and military contracts. Roger owned ACR Industries from 1977 to 2000, and he did very well for himself, especially when he sold the company. So now he was retired. Life slowed down a little bit for him. He lived out in Washington Township and he had a 10,000 square foot mansion. It was formerly owned by Red Wing hockey player Dino Ciccarelli. There's a huge pool, a hot tub on the main bedroom balcony. The mansion sits on almost 3 acres of land, and Redfin has it currently listed at over $2 million. It says it's an extraordinary gated estate with custom details and quality materials throughout. Right outside the kitchen area, you have access to the pool and the patio. There's an attached 4-car garage, And then there's a separate 4-car garage for a collector, which Roger was. It had dual curved staircases, a grand 2-story entry space in the foyer, and a gorgeous open floor plan. This home had 18 different rooms, including a library. Roger loved and collected expensive cars too, so there was an entire full garage of them. What was missing was someone to share it all with, and he finally found them, the Johnsons, Marilu, and her 3 boys, who he adored from the minute he was introduced to them. But let me back up. It wasn't long after Roger and Marilu were introduced that she started bringing him up around Jarrell, Jared, and Jason. It had been some time since their father had passed away, a couple of years now, but her excitement couldn't be contained. The boys noticed that Marilu was more cheerful, and she just radiated happiness. She was always excited to tell them stories about the adventures she and Roger would go on. She told her sons it felt like they had known each other forever, and it was apparent Marilu was head over heels for Roger. He had swept her off her feet. All the boys would hear about was, "Roger wants to take me here. Roger wants me to go to this restaurant. Roger wants to take me to see a play. Roger bought me this." It was Roger, Roger, Roger. The boys were happy for their mom. She deserved love and to be loved. And of course, like many children, they were apprehensive about who this man was that was coming into their lives. But finally, Marilu introduced Roger to her sons, and they liked him right away. He treated them with respect. He treated them like family from day one. He was kind-hearted, not judgmental, and he was generous, not just with Marilu, whom he treated like a queen, but he wanted to spoil her 3 sons as well. As teenagers, the boys were very impressionable, and Roger knew how to impress. He would bring them over to his house to see his luxury cars, ones that they had only heard about but had never seen before. And now, they were driving in them. Rolls-Royces, Bugattis. Not only that, but he would take the family on lavish vacations they would never have experienced otherwise. Marilu had only dreamed about a life like this. She was from the Philippines and never thought this would be her reality. But Roger was more than willing to give her and the boys anything they needed and wanted. It wasn't just about material things either, not at all. Roger would have dinner with the boys and tell them how much he loved their mother and how much he loved them. He was a genuine person. He had been a loving husband before his wife passed away and had children of his own, so he was a good dad. He knew loss too, not just because his first wife passed away, but because his son Jeffrey died in a horrific car accident. He had also remarried, but it ended in divorce. Roger wanted to spend the time he had left in life making himself happy and the people around him happy. The people in his life right now were Marilu, Jared, Jason, Jarrell, and of course, Scott too. His other adult children had lives of their own, but they still kept in touch. There was just something different about having these teenage boys to take care of and to teach life lessons to show them the world. It gave Roger a new purpose in life, and that's exactly what he needed. It got him out of his depression, and he was like a new man. Marilu really brought out the best in him. After just a few months of being serious with one another, Roger asked Marilu and the boys to move into his house. He wanted them to be a family, but Marilu declined at first. Anyway, it was about a year after they had been dating that Marilu finally took Roger up on the offer. After all, he had more than enough room in that big mansion. Scott also ended up moving in there as well. Now they were just one big happy family under one roof, and it was an exciting time that spring of 2005. Roger didn't ease up on his generosity either. He would take the family out for lavish vacations and dinners at the nicest restaurants. They would travel the world, and he would buy the boys anything they wanted. He literally bought them cars as gifts. First, it was Marilu. He gifted her a convertible Cadillac for herself, and then an Escalade SUV to bring the boys around. Then, when each boy turned 16, he bought them a car of their own too. Roger really didn't get out as much once he was retired. Most of his friends had been connections that came from his work on previous projects or ones he was still a part of. Marilu was introduced to Roger's longtime housekeeper, Tanya, who practically lived on the premises as she was there daily to routinely take care of the house. But Tanya was more than just a housekeeper. She became a friend of Roger's, a confidant. And when she was introduced to Marilu, they became best of friends. That's just how Roger and Marilu were. They were so kind and so welcoming. Roger even befriended his plumber, David Wright. They would kick back and have a few drinks after David had a long, hard day of work on Roger's property. For example, if Roger hired anyone, a lawyer, someone to do his bookkeeping or accounting, even landscaping, or just to fix something on the property, it wouldn't be a surprise if they became a friend to him. Soon, they would be enjoying a game of golf, boating, or fishing together with him and his new family. Well, not everyone in Roger's life liked the idea of Marilu being part of his family at all, and maybe you can guess who took issue with it. His biological kids, Gregory, age 45, and Heather, age 43 at the time. They weren't far off in age from Marilu, and it bothered them that this new woman was in their father's life, gallivanting around and using his money they thought they would inherit until Marilu came into the picture. After their mother died, they figured that once Roger bit the dust, they would get his fortune, splitting it among the 3 remaining children. Scott, of course, wasn't the one taking issue with any of this. As you know, he was the one who introduced Roger and Marilu. He wanted the best for his father. But from what I read, it was the oldest son, Gregory Blanchard, who had the biggest issue with his father's new life. And he wasn't shy about making it known either. It was weird because when Roger's adult children would come around during the holidays or for a special occasion, they were cordial with Marilu and the boys. But after they realized that Marilu was not going anywhere, that she was here to stay as Roger's new girlfriend, and then when she moved into the mansion, they began their campaign against her. They started accusing her of being a gold digger. They said she was taking advantage of their father. They thought that if she got any closer, maybe Roger would end up marrying her, and that meant she would inherit his fortune in addition to, or even instead of, Roger's own children. Well, they were not going to let that happen. Not at all. Soon, Gregory and Heather expressed their disapproval of Marilu and her children, and they were not nice about it either. I was thinking, this is a grown man. He's a father. He's a grandfather. I think he can decide for himself, especially when it comes to his romantic affairs. But of course, Roger loved his biological children as well. He cared about how they felt, and he did his best to listen to their concerns. I mean, here he was, spending exorbitant amounts of money which they found to be unreasonable. In their eyes, it meant less money for them to inherit. But to be fair, they were also worried about their father's health, because he had been drinking more and more. Since he was having more fun and excitement in his life since Marilu came along, Roger had started drinking more. His children were worried. They thought it could probably get out of hand again. The thing is, Marilu was on the exact same page. She didn't want Roger drinking excessively. She would watch him and make sure that he didn't. However, that seemed to also be a little bit of an excuse for his adult children to start stopping by the house more because, they had to check on him. They were worried. So they started coming around a lot more and getting in his business. It seemed to also increase their apparent hatred toward Marilu because she was such a fixture in Roger's life. Over time, they really started to become controlling, and they were attempting to stop Roger from spending money on Marilu and her kids. This put a lot of stress on everyone involved, especially Marilu. It got to a point where there were constant interrogations of Marilu and rude comments, which made her have a panic attack. She had to call 911 for medical assistance. One of Roger's kids even had the audacity to say to her, "You're never going to win." But a part of me sees both sides. I don't agree with this at all, but I see how it could be hard to accept that your father loves someone else, maybe someone that he wants in his life more than you. The kids could have felt slighted, and I guess I could also try to put myself in their shoes. Millions of dollars are at stake. They probably feel that, as the biological children, they're owed that money and deserve it, more than some strange lady, in their opinion, that their dad just randomly met and who is now living in his $2 million home with her 3 children. But I still don't agree with berating her and causing her physical pain in the form of a nervous breakdown. That's not okay. Roger had to decide for himself, and he had. His choice was Marilu, and he advised his children to stay out of his business. This was all happening in 2006. By 2007, things were on Roger's terms. It went back to Roger, being generous, spending his money as he pleased, and doting on Marilu, Jarrell, Jason, and Jared. Things were good. They had really settled into their lives at the mansion in Washington Township at 5880 West Road. Marilu spent time working out, shopping, spending time with her kids, tending to the household, working in the garden, having family dinners, hosting house parties, and getting to know people from their community. She also spent time with her friends. Jarrell and Jared were in high school, and Jason, who was 20, was deciding on what career to pursue. Roger was into helping young people start their own businesses. He would often give advice to people around him, especially younger men, whenever they wanted to know how to succeed. Life was good until June 14th of that year. On June 14th, 2007, Jared came home from school just like he had done for the past 2 years they had spent living with Roger. But for the past 2 years, Marilu would be there to greet him, ask him how his day was, smile happily, and spend quality time with him. That day was different. Jared didn't hear his mom's voice as he called out to her. When he came through the front door, he didn't see her anywhere in the house, and she wasn't outside either. That was very unusual. Jared noticed Marilu's car was still at the residence, so he wondered where she could be. The house was huge, but Marilu would usually be downstairs at this time of day, or at least hear him call out to her. He thought maybe she had been picked up by a friend and figured she'd be back soon. There wasn't a huge cause for concern at this point, but by the time both Jarrell and Jared were home, and there was still no sign of Marilu, that's when they got worried. So they did what most of us would do in modern-day circumstances. They called her cell phone. But oddly, it went straight to voicemail. That was out of the ordinary. She always answered, especially if it was a call from home. If, for whatever reason, she didn't answer, she would call them back in just a minute. But going to voicemail was not normal. It concerned the teenage boys. They wanted to know where their mom was. Of course, Roger was home, so they asked him, "Where's Mom?" He said he hadn't seen her since that morning. He mentioned she had some errands to run and had told him she was going to go for a jog afterward. He said he had no idea where she could have gone, especially without her vehicle. This caused them to worry that she might have gotten hurt. Maybe she was hit by a car, maybe she fell and got hurt and was lying somewhere in a ditch. But before panicking, they reached out to Tanya, Roger's longtime housekeeper. If anyone knew where she was, it would be Tanya. She was familiar with everything going on in the household and was a close friend of Marilu's. The boys called Tanya and asked if she knew where their mom was. She said she didn't, but would try to see if she could get in touch with Marilu. Just like they had, Tanya called Marilu's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. At this point, knowing all the facts, Marilu's car was at the house, she didn't greet Jared when he came home, she wasn't at the house, and she wasn't answering her phone. Tanya actually got a terrible gut feeling. She felt something bad had happened. Tanya told the boys and Roger that if Marilu didn't show up soon, they should call the police and report her missing. First, they proceeded to call friends in the area, but no one had reported hearing from her or seeing her that day. She hadn't told anyone she was going anywhere, and she would never have left them without letting them know. It was getting later and later. By the time the boys had begun calling around, it was close to evening. They had done what they could to locate her, to no avail. It was now late at night. Finally, a little after midnight, Roger decided it was time to call the police. He phoned the Macomb County Sheriff's Office and reported that his live-in girlfriend was missing. The dispatcher took this report, including everything we already know, how they noticed she was gone when Jared got home, how they called her and it went to voicemail, and how they checked with close friends, finding no sign of her. The dispatcher told Roger that they would send someone out, and they did. The first officer on the scene the morning of June 15, 2007, was Macomb County Deputy Sheriff Jason Abro. He did his job well to find out whether Marilu was really missing or if something else was going on. What is that something else? For one, she's an adult. We've heard this before. She has free will and the means to leave on her own volition. Or maybe there's a simple explanation. Maybe there's a note that no one saw. Was her cell phone left behind and now it's dead? Maybe she's with a friend or family member. Maybe she did get hurt and she's lying somewhere. Or maybe worse. These officers have to take it step by step. There have been cases where people have locked themselves in their own basement and then their phone dies. There have been cases where, on a site like this, where there could be a guest house and woods, a person has fallen and couldn't get up. There are just so many scenarios, and they don't normally start at the worst case first. However, knowing that he's going to Washington Township, there were definitely some presuppositions. This is one of the wealthiest areas, and it's not uncommon for separation, divorce, and even affairs to be a reason why a woman ups and leaves her boyfriend or husband behind. So officers want to keep an open mind, especially considering the time frame that this was occurring in, which I will mention in just a moment. I alluded to it at the beginning. Another mom had gone missing just months earlier from the exact same neighborhood. So this really made officers' antennas go up. You'll know why. But he sets foot outside of Roger's home, and he is taken aback by how big this house really is. It's definitely not an everyday place you get called out to, and if they do get called out to this area, it's honestly usually a dispute with two neighbors over someone borrowing their lawnmower a little too long and not giving it back, or someone cutting their grass over my property line. Very trivial matters. Deputy Abro was in awe. He rang the doorbell. Scott Blanchard answered the door and explained that his father was up in his bedroom and led the way. When the deputy went inside, he realized Roger wasn't just in the main bedroom of the house. He was bedridden. Something just wasn't right here. It's true Roger was an older gentleman, he was 71 years old, but it looked like he was just in bad shape. He was incoherent. I guess drunk would be more fitting since it was obvious, looking around the room, Roger had been drinking. There were a number of empty bottles of alcohol just scattered on the floor, on the dressers, and by the foot of his bed. Roger couldn't provide that much information. All he could say was that he hadn't seen Marilu since the previous morning. He did add that it was unlike his girlfriend to leave without letting him know. They asked Roger if he could recall what Marilu was wearing the last time he saw her. He wasn't very specific. He said he thinks it was a button-down shirt and slacks, but he didn't know what color they were. But Roger couldn't recall the colors of Marilu's clothing. He also had no idea where she could have gone, not even guesses, like, oh, she might be over at this friend's house, and that actually raised a red flag with the deputy. As Marilu's boyfriend of a number of years, it was odd to him that there was such a lack of information being provided. It made him think that maybe Mr. Roger Blanchard himself was holding back some details. So he made note of it. This prompted a new set of questions in a very different direction. Deputy Abro asked Roger if he and Marilu had been in a fight. Had they argued about anything that day? What was their relationship like? Could there be a reason that she would want to leave without telling him? What about the children? What was their relationship like? Any arguments between her and her boys? Roger insisted there were no arguments with anyone. As far as he knew, everyone had a good relationship and there was no fighting. This didn't leave the deputy with much to go on. So the next thing he did was briefly speak with the kids. He decided to pile them into a squad car and retrace Marilu's jogging path. They wanted to see if there were any clues left behind. Maybe she did get hurt. Maybe a car hit her. Maybe they'd find a shoe or her cell phone on the side of the road. They were looking for anything that could point them in the right direction. They looked everywhere. They went around the neighborhood and even to the surrounding areas, but it turned up nothing. Deputy Abro decided that he needed to call in an investigator to help him with the case. Detective Mark Grammatico arrived from the Macomb County Sheriff's Office. At this point, he was briefed on all the information that Abro had. They decided to ask Roger for permission to search the premises, and he said yes. Do anything you can to find her. So they did. They went through the whole house, room by room. It was actually a pretty easy task because the house was immaculate. Everything had its own place. The only room that seemed pretty disheveled was the main room where Roger was. That room was lived in. It was uncapped and terribly messy. However, it seemed like a place where Roger went to be left alone. We will get back to him because there's definitely something going on there. But right now, Detective Grammatico was leading the investigation, going room by room, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Look at this house again. I'm just showing you the rooms. It's huge. 6 full bathrooms, 1 half bath. They had to check every shower curtain, moving it aside to see if Marilu was in there. There are 4 bedrooms on the upper level, the main bedroom on the lower level where Roger was. There's a full kitchen, a library, a laundry room, and even a room with a pool table. It was also an office, a family room, and a dining room. Then of course there's the exterior, the pool area, the fenced-in yard, the garages, and all the land around the home. It was a lot. They took pictures as they went through, documenting the way things looked when they arrived. You can see from these pictures just how organized and clean this home was. They didn't find Marilu anywhere, so they had officers conduct a canvass of the surrounding area, going door to door, asking neighbors if they had heard or seen anything. The problem, or maybe this isn't a problem, but it was for the investigation, was that the houses were not close together. As a matter of fact, the house itself was so large that it would be hard for someone even upstairs to hear anything going on elsewhere in the house, let alone a neighbor far away. But then again, we know noise does travel, and someone could have seen Marilu leave or jogging. Who knows? Back at the house, they actually drained the pool. They wanted to see if perhaps Marilu had drowned. She wasn't in there, and no one at the home had reported hearing anything unusual or seeing anything. The boys were at school most of the day, so they wouldn't have known if anything happened to her. And look at this area around the home, it's basically woods. It would all have to be searched, and this was a big job. Could she have walked off and hurt herself? One of the neighbors actually came forward and told officers that they heard yelling at some point during the day before. That's very important information, but what kind of yelling? Who was it? That couldn't be answered by the neighbor. They didn't see it, they just heard it. But it was something the officers took note of. Of course, we all know where the fingers are about to point. It's obvious. The first person investigators are going to look at is the partner. Domestic disputes are typical circumstances that result in someone going missing, whether on their own or because of foul play. Investigators want to know everything they can find out about Roger Blanchard. Here's this millionaire with the means to do just about anything. Could there be a reason that he'd want to get rid of Marilu? Maybe it became too much for him to handle. Marilu, her 3 boys, all in this house, and he's footing the bill. They know there's someone who could possibly shed some light on all of this. Someone who knows this family very well. The housekeeper. She was bound to have seen or heard something if there had been any altercations in the past. So they reach out to Tanya to get an idea of what the Blanchard-Johnson household was like. After all, there were a lot of different personalities under one roof. Scott, the biological child of Roger, Marilu, the boys, and the older boyfriend that the kids referred to as Grandpa. But the boys insisted that Roger and their mom didn't fight. They had a loving relationship. However, we know that parents can hide things from their children. So investigators turn to Tanya, and she says that she never once witnessed Marilu and Roger fight. They didn't have a perfect relationship, but who does? Tanya pointed out the obvious. Roger had a drinking problem. Sadly, it's something he picked up after the losses I mentioned. After his first wife died, he drank. After losing his son in a tragic car wreck, he drank. And after his divorce, he reached for the bottle again. Just a side note, when I heard 2 of his family members had died, it did raise an eyebrow or red flag, and it did for detectives as well. I know things happen, it's not that uncommon, but we're talking about context here. This would make 3 people close to Roger who had died in an accident or are now missing. So they had to keep that in focus. Roger was not at an age where he could hold down his liquor. It was wreaking havoc on his body. His health was declining as a result, and it was essentially poisoning him. Tanya explained that Marilu wasn't a fan of Roger's drinking. She loved him, she cared about him, and because of that, she would hide his alcohol all the time. She would put it behind curtains, behind furniture, anywhere she could to keep it out of his sight. It wasn't the best way to deal with it, but he was a grown man. She couldn't control him. But she tried to help him to the extent that she could, hoping it would lessen the amount he was drinking at the very least. Roger had actually been to rehab before, the Betty Ford Clinic. It has a very solid track record of helping people overcome addiction to drugs and alcohol. It's a non-profit residential treatment center in California. The center was founded in 1982 by former First Lady Betty Ford. Roger had gotten sober before, but recently he started drinking again. It began casually, but someone who has struggled with addiction in the past can fall back into it. And that's what happened. Tanya said that was the only negative aspect of the household, the fact that Roger was holed up in his bedroom, drinking himself into a stupor most days. But other days, he was okay. It was unpredictable. But the thing is, Tanya is an employee of Roger's, so unfortunately, these types of witness statements can be less reliable. Let's just say they don't want to get fired, so they leave details out. Good thing Tanya was able to provide the police with information about another person who might know where Marilu could be, someone she confided in. That person was her friend Gina, and she gets a knock at her door later that day. She had been friends with Marilu for years. They talked on a regular basis, and they hung out often. She was bound to have information that others did not, because she's not connected to Roger. This was a friend of Marilu's before she got into a relationship with him. The officers informed Gina that they were there about Marilu and explained that she had gone missing. Her family was worried. At first, Gina was shocked, but at the same time, she told the officers that she was hoping this was all just a misunderstanding. Maybe Marilu was just with family and hadn't had the chance to let anyone know. Perhaps she went on a spur-of-the-moment trip and would be back before they knew it, to explain that she was so sorry and didn't want to worry anyone. Gina wasn't so sure that there was anything to be worked up about yet, because Marilu was very independent. She had family overseas, so maybe they should check with them. When they were informed that Marilu was actually a native of the Philippines, they started to wonder if she could have had a family emergency and left to go back home to her loved ones without informing anyone. It turns out a search of the house revealed that Marilu's passport was missing. Detectives began to locate family members and finally got in touch with Marilu's sister. She told investigators she hadn't heard from her sister, so she was not overseas with family. Now they had ruled out the possibility that Marilu had left on her own. Her car was sold, the house showed no other missing vehicles, and none of her close friends knew where she was. She hadn't left town for her home country. They had nowhere else to turn but to look back at Roger, the man who had reported her missing and was probably the last person to see her. Detectives started to look at specifics related to Roger and Marilu, beginning with the fact that Roger was a much older man. Macomb County Sheriff Mark Hackle joined the investigation and wondered about the story between Roger and Marilu. Yes, it seemed from the outside they had a great relationship, but Hackle couldn't help thinking about the possibility that Marilu could have truly been taken advantage of by Roger, especially as he became more unstable. A scenario that went through his mind was that maybe Marilu was interested in Roger's money and was playing nice with another motive to skim off the top or take the money and run. Perhaps Roger found out. That would be a huge motive to get back at her or get rid of her. The partner is usually the number one suspect, and it doesn't take long for the media to run with that narrative. Now's the time I finally get to tell you one major reason this community pointed their fingers at Roger Blanchard. It was because of another case that happened in the same community. They had been reeling from a case that occurred just a few months prior to Marilu's disappearance. Now, for her name, Tara Lynn Grant. It was a Valentine's Day mystery that ended in her murder. She was also a mother of 3 who disappeared, and her husband was the last known person to have seen her alive. His name was Stephen Grant. Many have said he reminds them of Brian Koberger, who is currently charged and awaiting trial on 4 counts of murder in the Idaho University case that happened back in November 2022. This community had a built-in distrust for this millionaire boyfriend whose girlfriend and mother of 3 boys had vanished. The media actually jumped on Marilu's case pretty quickly, piggybacking off of Tara Lynn Grant's case. Sheriff Hackle had been the main spokesperson in Tara's case, and now he was having to do press conferences related to Marilu. Just 36 hours into the investigation, he was telling the public that Marilu went missing under suspicious circumstances. He was trying to use the media to field leads. It had been a crazy year for this community. They were on edge. Just like in Tara's case, something didn't seem right. Investigators had to figure out what it was. As they pressed Roger to give them more information and kept asking him questions about his relationship with Marilu, he became increasingly upset. He said his concern was finding her. The more they spoke to him and observed his overall behavior, the more they realized this man was not in good health at all. He was quite frail. The physical condition he was in at the time made it highly unlikely that he would be able to cause harm to Marilu, who was much healthier, younger, and athletic. Of course, there's always a possibility of someone using a gun, but they couldn't be so quick to infer foul play was involved. They merely had a missing person at this point. If something did happen to Marilu, it didn't seem like Roger could have done it. He was also very cooperative, letting the investigators have access to everything, every inch of his home, and any records they wanted. He was more than willing to do whatever it took to help. But there was also a chance that he could have paid someone to take care of Marilu for him if she took issue with something she was doing. That couldn't be ruled out yet. Maybe someone else made her disappear for him. But as far as his body language and demeanor, it didn't seem like Roger was their man. Jared, Jarrell, and Jason didn't think so either. They told investigators that Roger had nothing to do with their mother vanishing. He was way too in love with her, and he loved the boys. There was no way. So they were back to interviewing family and friends once again, asking if they could think of anyone who might want to hurt Marilu or make her disappear. Tanya comes forward and reveals that there was someone who had it out for Marilu in a bad way. Remember Gregory and Heather Blanchard, Roger's biological adult children? We heard some of what went on, how they treated Marilu, threatening her, sending her into a nervous breakdown. But there's more, and it wasn't making them look very nice. I could not believe this, Tanya says. If there's anyone she thought wanted to get rid of Marilu, it was Roger's children. They hated Marilu and her kids, and they wanted Roger to break up with her. They seemed willing to do whatever it took to make sure that happened, and they tried. According to Tanya, a year ago Roger was admitted to the Betty Ford Clinic. While he was there unable to protect her, his kids, along with her high-powered attorney, had Marilu and the boys evicted, literally evicted from his home. Not just, oh, we're gonna, evicted, forced out, thrown out. She had no choice but to move into a motel. Roger's children got a moving truck, put all of her things inside of it, and then locked the doors. They wouldn't let her in. They actually told her, nobody wants you here. And all the while, Roger was not even aware this was going on. Can you even imagine? These evil people actually told Marilu that their father didn't want her there, the man that she loves. Because of that, she didn't even try to contact him. She was hurt, she was upset, she had nowhere to turn and no one to turn to. Well, Scott, Roger's other son who lived with him and Marilu and the boys, investigators want to know what was going on. What was all this about? You got Marilu evicted, and Scott admits it's true, but it wasn't him. His two other siblings got him, and everyone willing to jump on board together. They posed it like they were concerned that Roger was drinking too much, and they blamed Marilu. They wanted to send him back to the Betty Ford Clinic all the way in California. And about the eviction? Well, they justified that because they said, you know what? We can kick Marilu out because Roger doesn't live here right now and you can't live here without him. And I'm thinking, why not? She's a grown woman. She's been dating him for a while now. They live together. This is as much her house as it is his. So who are they to tell her to leave? Plus, wouldn't she have a say in what happens to her loved one? Well, because this was an exit plan for her to get out of his life under the guise of, oh, we're just really worried about her dad. Really? No, because they wanted to inherit his money. Wouldn't it make more sense that they wouldn't care about his health, huh? But they had to be sure he was alive and well so they could get rid of the woman standing in the way of their cash. Investigators see this as a major red flag. But wait, there's more. Of course there's more. Why would it end there? Get this, to add insult to injury, Roger's kids went so far as to erase all of Marilu's numbers, anyone else's numbers associated with her. They got rid of anything linking to her. They deleted things off of Roger's computers, his devices, his phones, so there was no way for him to get in touch with Marilu when he came home. Roger was in the dark. He agreed to go to the Betty Ford Clinic because he was under the impression that Marilu was in on the plan. He had no idea that they had kicked her out. Jason told investigators that he remembers going through all of this. Apparently, Roger had gotten a hold of a phone and was calling friends and other family members, telling them that he wanted to get in touch with Marilu to have her call him. He wanted to get out of this place. He was begging to go back home. He could only last a week. He couldn't take it anymore. He was able to check himself out, and he left. And when he got back home, he was furious. He thought Marilu had left him. Remember, he had no idea what was going on. Well, Tanya informs him about what happened, that Marilu was evicted by his own children. And he went ballistic. He called them up and said, "I want Marilu back now." He couldn't believe that they would do such a thing like that. It was disgraceful to kick her and her boys out like that. Eventually, he was able to get in touch with one of their mutual friends, and they were willing to pass on a message to Marilu. Marilu agreed to speak to Roger again. Luckily, they were able to reconcile. Marilu and the boys moved back into Roger's mansion. And it gets worse. As investigators are looking into all this, they find something that seems to make Marilu look really bad at first glance. But they're able to dig deeper, and when they figure out what was really going on, it made Roger's kids look even more evil. This was all about greed, money, and jealousy. It was clear when they found a restraining order that had been filed by the same attorney that the Rogers kids hired to help the new victim, Marilu. Apparently, unbeknownst to Roger himself, in his frail health and mental state, he was in habitual intoxication. Either his attorney signed using power of attorney, or they tricked Roger into signing a restraining order against Marilu, something he would never do. He even admits that later to investigators when they confront him about it. He said he didn't sign that. But in this restraining order, the attorney said that because of the friction Marilu was causing his family, Roger wanted her gone. That he was in fear of Marilu and her kids, and they needed to leave. On paper, sure, it looks like Marilu is the enemy, the horrible gold digger trying to steal Roger's money. That was the way these people made her out to look. But through their investigation, it was clear that's not Marilu. She was a kind-hearted woman with no ill intentions whatsoever. The narrative being constructed by Roger's kids was contrary to the facts that they gathered. Roger told investigators his children even had power of attorney over him. They filed a restraining order without his knowledge. Now that's pretty extreme. It never went into effect because there was a court date he didn't go to. But this is very strategic. It was a plan, consulting with an attorney, building a case against Marilu, a paper trail of incident reports, documentation, so that they could win. As one of them put it to her face during that meltdown, "It's obvious to me Marilu was a problem for Roger's kids, a problem they wanted gone." Even after Marilu was back in the home with Roger, the issues between her and his children did not end. Roger wasn't even on speaking terms with them for months after what they did. They were on bad terms up until the time Marilu went missing. They had the motive, means, and the opportunity to get close enough to her to hurt her. By June 18th, 4 days had gone by since anyone had seen or heard from Marilu. Now, it's time to hear what Roger's children have to say for themselves. Investigators are shocked by their response. They were indifferent. They didn't seem to care. They were insensitive. No concern at all. That was an issue for investigators, but they claimed to have alibis for the day that she went missing. So the investigators needed to look into all their alibis. For now, Roger's kids are still on their list of persons of interest, and they put them on 24-hour surveillance to watch their every move. Maybe it would lead them to their next clue, but now they have to move on to collect more information. Regardless, this was about finding Marilu. Tanya lets them know that she noticed something else. When she was let back into the house shortly after the initial search that day, she made a note of something. She told investigators that something was off. She said she and Marilu were the type of people who liked things a certain way. They had routines and habits, and I can relate as well, but they would put things in certain places. Everything had a specific home, so to speak. For one thing, Tanya noticed right away that Marilu's purse was missing from a table that she put it on every single day. When she walked in the foyer, she would come in and routinely drop her purse on that table, and it wasn't there. She would always then remove her shoes and put those in a certain place as well. Well, they were not how she kept them. They were knocked over on the floor, like she had quickly had to kick them off or tripped out of them. It just didn't look right. Even more telling is what Tanya found in the living room. Marilu's laundry, it was all over. It was dumped out of the laundry basket as though she was in the middle of sorting it to be folded or washed and then was interrupted. Tanya would know best. She was there all the time. She knew every item of clothing that Marilu had, all of her shoes, even her jewelry. And that was another big clue. Tanya looked high and low for a specific piece of Marilu's jewelry. It was very special and very expensive. It was a necklace that Roger had just recently gifted Marilu just a few months prior to her going missing. This was not a necklace that someone would be able to miss. It was made of a number of large diamonds, wrapped all the way around her neck, and then it dropped down in the front in a string of even more diamonds. It was not an ordinary everyday necklace. This was something you would never put on casually. It was a statement piece for special events. Tanya called it over the top, and I've been showing the exact necklace on the screen. It is stunning, it looked perfect on her, and it was missing. So was Marilu's purse, the keys to her car, and her cell phone. Those are very personal items. They usually go where the owner goes. When the investigators questioned Roger about the necklace, he had no idea where it was, but he told them it was a yellow and white diamond necklace, 14.19 carats. It cost him $252,560.61. So investigators came up with a new theory. They think Marilu could have been robbed. Maybe someone knew about that necklace and had an altercation with her, and maybe they kidnapped her. However, other than the shoes being out of place and the laundry being uncapped, there were no signs of foul play. No blood, no real evidence that harm had been done to Marilu. Nevertheless, investigators asked Tanya to make a list of everyone who had gone in and out of that house on a regular basis, or had been there in the past few months. There was a lot of people on that list, including, of course, the children, Jared, Jarrell, and Jason, and Roger's other son, Scott, among others. They had to look into everyone, even the boys. Then something did come up in relation to one of Marilu's sons. Just a few months before this happened, he was arrested for violating probation. This was in relation to a couple of felony charges in connection with theft. He allegedly stole items from someone's vehicle. As part of his deal, Marilu was ordered to pay fees in the form of payments to the court, and those payments were to start in June 2007, the exact same month she had gone missing. She was reported missing on June 15th, which was the day before the first payment was due. So there was some suspicion around the timing of Marilu's disappearance. Maybe she fled because she didn't want to have to pay the court fees. Investigators were unwilling to discount any theory, so they looked into how this court payment might be connected to Marilu's disappearance, or worse, whether one of her sons could have possibly wanted to get their hands on that piece of jewelry. They still had other people on Tanya's list that they had to look into, and many different leads they needed to follow up on as well. They were going down the list, interviewing each person who had come by, routinely visited, or worked with Roger in the past several months. Lawyers, accountants, business partners. They were all contacted. Most of them weren't around on the day Marilu was last seen. However, there was one person who was, because he was a regular employee of Roger's. I mentioned him once before. Just like Tanya was always there, David was always there. He was Roger's handyman and plumber. Tanya said David was a friend to Roger. He was a family man. He also was there to help other families as well. He was always offering his services to anyone in need. So they asked Roger about his handyman as well. Roger sort of repeated what Tanya said to investigators, that David was a friend. He helped around the house, doing odd jobs, renovating, fixing things. But they were really close. He was actually like a son to Roger, and he'd be a great person to interview in case he saw anything or knew anything about Marilu. He was always at the house, so they wanted to contact him. Roger also told them that they were somewhat business partners, unofficially though, friends who just help one another out. David had come to him some time ago, and they were hanging out, doing what they loved the most, talking about business. David wanted to start his own plumbing business. He no longer wanted to work for a company, but wanted one he could call his own. Roger was impressed by his tenacity and wanted to help him out. First, he asked David what was holding him back from getting his business off the ground. David said he didn't have the extra money needed to get things going. It was hard when he was working paycheck to paycheck. So Roger happily agreed to invest in David's business and generously gave him $50,000 to get started. That was more than enough to get things off the ground. Roger explained to the investigators that they never signed anything formal. This was just a contract between friends, and they basically just shook on it. So David started making things happen. He got a trailer with the name of his business on it, Dave's Plumbing and Handyman Services. He got licensed and insured, and of course, continued to provide services to Roger under his new company. Roger told David that he didn't need to repay him right away. He had money, it wasn't about that. But he said whenever David's company started to turn a profit, he could start making payments to him. Investigators wanted to know the details, like how long it had been since Roger gave David the money. Roger said it was last year at some point. They asked if David made any payments, and Roger said no, but he added that they had an agreement that until David could pay him back, he would just do work around the house free of charge. So they get his contact information, knowing he would be a good person to speak with about whether he'd seen or heard anything out of the ordinary because he was there on the day that Marilu went missing. They call him down to the station and he tells them what they already know. He's a friend of Roger's and Marilu's. He was their go-to handyman for anything they needed, big or small, complete renovations to fixing something simple like their hot tub on the main bedroom balcony. He said that the hot tub had been acting up lately, but no job was too big or too small for him. He was very forthcoming. He talked all about Roger helping him out with his business, getting it off the ground, and how he was very grateful for that. It was clear that David was part of Roger's inner circle. He treated his friends equally, whether they were plumbers or lawyers. David would be able to provide more insight into what Marilu was like and if he noticed anything out of the ordinary. David does tell them he was on duty at Roger's place on June 14th. He had gone and purchased a replacement part for the hot tub. He said that he did run into Marilu as he was getting ready to install the part. She was leaving and told him she was going to buy some mulch for the garden. If he needed anything, she said to call her on her cell phone. So they asked him if he made any calls to her. He said, "Yeah, I actually did. I don't recall what it was in reference to, probably the hot tub, but she never answered." They asked David what time he recalls leaving, and he said around 2 or 2:30 that afternoon. This is really important because it went to the timeline of events and the last time anyone saw her. This was after Roger had seen Marilu that morning. Investigators were anxious to look into Marilu's phone records, which they had already requested. Now they also had David's information and his phone number. They were able to see what time he called her and get a more accurate timeline of events that day. They knew, by David saying so, that he was the last person to see Marilu before she went missing. And you know what that means? He's now on the radar just like everyone else. He's someone who could have had something to do with her disappearance. So they have to do their due diligence and check David out. They're looking for everything: tower information for Marilu's phone, the calls she took during the day, and the time frame. It was all very valuable information. Undercover officers at this point are keeping tabs on David, just like they were on Roger's kids, to see if it led to anything suspicious. They tailed behind him as he drove back to his home with his family and just went to bed. Meanwhile, they were poring over these phone records. David had indeed made the last 2 phone calls that Marilu had picked up, but David said he only made 1 phone call to Marilu. Also, the data showed his phone pinging off a tower that was close to Roger's house. They knew he was there that day, but it also pinged off a tower near a place called West Bloomfield. This was a 40-minute drive, so they wondered why he would leave Roger's place if he was about to fix the hot tub. They pressed him about it, and he told them something that stuck with them. Something about leaving because Marilu canceled the work on the hot tub that day after he'd gone out of his way to purchase this expensive part that he needed. He explained to her what the part cost, and apparently she kind of blew him off. She said, "You know what? I need to talk to Roger about this. I'll get back to you." They once again asked what the second phone call was about, and David was adamant there was no second phone call. He only made one phone call, but they knew that wasn't true. This made David look like he was lying. He was giving conflicting statements, and no one else interviewed had been caught in a lie. I mean, sure, he could have forgotten he called her 2 times, but they started to dig into what business he may have had all the way in Bloomfield that same day. That's when he stopped wanting to answer questions. He wasn't under arrest or anything like that, so he wasn't obligated to speak with them. He was doing this voluntarily. But since he wouldn't speak, the investigators went back and spoke with Tanya. She was there that day, so they asked her if she saw David. She said, "Yeah, that's why I gave you his info. I did see him and he creeped me out." So they wanted to know how. Tanya said she was doing her normal cleaning around the house when she heard a knock on the back door. That made her jump. She wasn't expecting someone to be out there. When she answered, she saw David. He looked surprised that it was her answering the door. Then he asked her, "What are you doing here on a Tuesday?" Which kinda caught her off guard. She wasn't aware that David was keeping tabs on which day Tanya worked. She found it really odd. Of course, she had seen him around the house here and there, but she was never into his business. She was always focused on her own work. She didn't know if David had a set schedule, but she certainly didn't think so. So she wondered why he would be so concerned with what she was doing and her being present that day. It probably wouldn't have meant that much to her if it wasn't for what he said and did next. He explained that he was there to fix the hot tub and really needed to speak to Roger right away. His eyes were all wide, he was sweating, and he looked on edge. Tanya honestly did not like the tone or his arrogant demeanor. He was acting like he owned the place, demanding her to just go get Roger right away. Tanya told him that Roger wasn't available, and you know what? He'll call you if it's important. He'll get back to you. That's when David's demeanor made her uncomfortable. It was like all of a sudden there was a look in his eyes, and something snapped. His eyes were just burning into hers, and his face changed. She didn't like it, so she just closed the door on him and locked all of the doors after he walked away. Maybe since David had known Roger a long time, he felt insulted that the housekeeper was standing in the way of him speaking with his friend. He had gone and purchased a part to do this work, and he had to work off the debt that he owed Roger. So it might be understandable that David was annoyed, but Tanya actually told investigators she was scared of him. And when they looked closer at David's phone records, his whereabouts did not match the information he had given investigators. They traced his location after leaving Roger's that day and found that he had stopped at a gas station. So they went there and asked the employee on duty if they knew who David was or if they recognized him. The employee said, "Yeah, I know exactly who he is because he's a regular and he was here on June 14th. The clerk mentioned that on that day, David came into the store, but oddly he was not his usual friendly self. She distinctly remembered this and said it threw her off. David was always social. He would ask how her day was and would be cordial, but not that day. This unusual behavior made her do a double take as she was on guard. Because of David's odd behavior, she noticed what looked like a footprint and blood on David's shirt. She couldn't be sure, but there was video surveillance from the store on that day. They made arrangements for that to be turned over to the investigators. To be fair, David got dirty all the time on the job, and what looked like blood to the employee might have been something else. Especially now that the authorities were looking into him in connection with a missing woman, they were eager to take a look. Before they could see what David did on camera, they pulled up information about any past offenses he might have been involved in. That's when they stumbled upon a fairly new report on file. It was from a day ago, June 22nd. West Bloomfield police were on patrol near an area of small cottages and saw a truck pulled over on the side of the road. The officers stopped to see if the driver needed any help. As the officer got closer and his headlights illuminated the rear of the truck, he noticed that the man was opening up the back and messing with something inside. That man was David Wright. This was all caught on body camera footage. It was late at night and dark. The officer asked David if he was okay, and he said, "Yeah, I just hit a possum and I'm giving it a proper burial." He proceeded to open up a garbage bag and show the officer the contents, which indeed included a poor little dead possum. The officer asked David if he lived close by, and he said, "Well, my family owns cottages in this area, and I'm just visiting." The officer left after this interaction, and that was it. Investigators went through the tape. There wasn't much to go off of. It's not uncommon to accidentally run over an animal trying to cross a busy road. They confirmed it was true. David's family did own a cottage there, and his phone records placed him there that night. But the very next day, they were informed by an undercover cop trailing David that he did something very suspicious. Yes, he stopped by a pawn shop. They wanted to know why, so they followed close behind him, but the store was closed. He got back into his truck, and they continued to tail him, hoping he'd lead them to their next clue. He did. His next stop was a local self-serve car wash that was open 24 hours. He put money in the spray cleaner machine, but oddly, didn't actually use it. Instead, he was seen rummaging through things in the back of his pickup truck. Finally, they caught him pulling a large garbage bag out of the truck bed and putting it into a trash receptacle at the car wash. As soon as David pulled away, they moved in and collected the large garbage bag. No search warrant was needed when someone throws things away. It's fair game. They opened it up and were shocked by what they found inside. Blood. At this point, you know what they're thinking. This has to be Marilu's blood. They don't know if it's really blood. They can't say it's blood unless they test it first. They immediately put a rush on getting it analyzed, and right away they get word that it is indeed blood. However, it can't be Marilu's because it's not human. It was from an animal, most likely roadkill, judging by the other contents found inside, including fur. Wow, that's a twist in the case. Just when they think they're truly onto something, it turns out it's possum blood. It makes sense, as the officers saw the possum in the black garbage bag the night before. But they still thought David's actions were odd. Why go to a car wash, pay for something, not use it, and then throw your garbage bags in a public trash can instead of the one at your house? That's when they finally got the video surveillance from the gas station. If you look at his shirt as he comes to the door, it does look like there's a dark stain on it. However, this is black and white, and the clerk at the gas station would have had a much better view. She said it was red, like blood. One thing they can see is his demeanor. Even though they don't know what he usually looked like, it did seem like he was in a rush to get in and out. But what if that was just possum blood? Would he really walk into a gas station instead of using a credit or debit card at the pump if he had a person's blood on him? Now, they really want to dig more into David and who he is. They go back to Tanya and ask if there's anything she didn't like about David, anything that had made her feel uncomfortable in the past. Tanya mentions that on the day of the incident, he was acting strange, but is there anything else he didn't give them? She recalls that back in February, just a few months before, she was at Roger's with her daughter hanging out with Marilu. She saw David go into Roger's office. She was only able to hear bits and pieces of their conversation, but could decipher that David was once again asking Roger for more money. More money after the $50,000 to invest in his plumbing company. Roger is usually very kind, patient, and generous, but this time he went off on David. Tanya couldn't hear the specific words, but it was definitely apparent that Roger was not happy. When David came out of that office and walked past Tanya, he just had that look on his face, what she called the look of death. She said she could never forget it. David said nothing, he just walked right past her and out the door. She actually hoped that he would never come back. He gave off a bad vibe she had never seen before, and she really didn't like it. Now that they had all this information on David, they decided to get him on a traffic stop. When they looked at the footage of the possum and him outside, they noticed that his license plate had a violation. It was expired or something small like that. So they stopped him, pulled him over, and told him to get out of his vehicle because the violation was an arrestable offense. As they were patting him down, they noticed something in one of his front pockets. This is when the adrenaline starts going wild. What is it? It was a prescription pill bottle. It felt off, like it was a little bit too heavy to be pills. The officer looked down. It was dark, but he saw something shiny. Can you guess what was inside? The bottle was clear, and at the bottom, the officer saw what appeared to be diamonds. So he opened up the top, took out the paper napkin, and it was filled with diamonds. Big yellow and white diamonds. Look at this evidence photo. They looked pristine and flawless. When they got David down to the station, they asked him where the diamonds came from. Clearly, the investigators believed these were the exact same diamonds from Marilu's necklace. But of course, they wanted to prove it and get as much info or lies as they could to build their case. David told them, "Oh, those are just my ex-wives." "Your ex-wives? Why would you have those?" the investigators asked. They laid out the diamonds and compared them to the necklace Roger reported missing. As the investigators looked at these diamonds, they were blown away by how beautiful they were. They weren't like anything they had ever seen before. But would there be justice for Marilu? It was obvious that these were not just random diamonds. They were indeed from the stolen $250,000 necklace. It was June 23rd, and they knew they finally had the right person in custody. They just needed to find out where Marilu was and what happened. They needed a confession. Only David knew the answers, and they didn't have enough to charge him with murder. It was time to interrogate him. Before he would talk, he asked to call his mom. After speaking with her, he said he was finally ready to tell them what happened, and that his mom told him he should do the right thing. He started by telling Detective Grammatica and another investigator in the room that he had always been friendly with Roger, that Roger had given him money out of the kindness of his own heart. But then he admitted that he bummed it away here and there. I think that's just another way to say he spent it. He said, I met some girl, and in his words, spiced up her world. He just spent the money, loaned some to his brother-in-law, and tried to come up with ways of getting money here and there. Well, guess what? They were on to his little plan. Bill Cataldo, the chief of homicide from Macomb County Prosecutor's Office, was listening to all of this. It's his job to weed through the lies. David had agreed to do the work around Rogers for free. Remember that? Except he found a workaround to get some extra money to get him out of his debt. He was working for free, but when something needed fixing, he would need parts, wouldn't he? He was able to convince a clerk at a hardware store to mark up the products and give him a receipt with a cost appearing to be a particular price that was way more than the product really costs. He would then show this to Roger, get the extra cash, pay the hardware clerk his kickback, and keep the change. Roger trusted him. He was very wealthy and wasn't questioning these purchases. However, Marilu was getting wise to the scheme. She didn't trust David and was onto him. So that day, when David brought her the receipt for the supposed hot tub pump, which was drastically overpriced, Roger wasn't available. David had to go to Marilu. He told her, "Look at the receipt. It was $2,400. I bought it. I need the money now." He would have made an extra grand from this scam. David explained to the investigators that Marilu pushed back. She confronted him, saying that she felt it was a rip-off. The price was way too high, and she wasn't going to pay it. She was going to tell Roger and said it was absurd to pay that much. That's when David said he got angry. He said, "You need to pay me now because I already bought the part." Marilu wasn't having it. She was a problem. David said he was just standing there by his trailer putting his tools away when he saw a knife in his bag. He took it, grabbed Marilu, and put the knife to her neck, saying, "I need money." She was terrified and kept asking, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" David said that at this point, his plan was just to kidnap her. But as he tried to get her into the back of his trailer, she was struggling to break free. With a knife to her neck, he was pushing her and finally got her over the threshold. She fell and brought him down with her. When he pulled her back up, he saw blood. He saw blood? There must have been a lot of it. That knife was either so sharp it cut into her jugular with the force of the fall, or there was much more to the story, so they pressed him for the rest of it. What happened next? David told investigators that at that point he could tell she was hurt badly and going into shock. She was just lying there looking at him. Did he call for help? No. Did he try to save her? No, he didn't. So what did he do? You may ask. He went inside and stole her purse. Then he went back to the trailer. He opened the door to find Marilu was still lying in a pool of blood, which was getting bigger and bigger. She wasn't moving, so listen to this in his words. He picked up the knife, and he poked her. He poked her to see if she would be moving, and she wasn't moving. No, you poke someone with your finger, you stab someone with a knife. I don't believe this for a minute. He stabbed her to make sure she was dead, because at that point, he knew he was going to get rid of her, take her things, and try to sell them. He went even further. He got a garden hose and sprayed down that entire driveway so there were no signs of blood. That's why the detectives didn't see any signs of force or struggle. David is fake crying in this interrogation room. Those are alligator tears for sure. He says it was an accident. And I don't think so, and neither did the authorities. They believed David went there with the intention of stealing from Roger. He already was doing so continuously by overcharging him, but David was even more desperate because he had run out of all of the money that Roger loaned him. Investigators think David was going to do whatever it took to get that cash, even if it meant killing for it. After he killed Marilu, he drove to get some gas at that gas station. That's when we see him on the surveillance camera. Then he drove Marilu's body out to Bloomfield. I showed you this area, it's about 30 miles away. They had questioned about why he was there. He said he was supposed to be fixing the hot tub. That's what piqued their interest in him, to begin with. While his family owns property on a lake called Lake Cass, a lake where he disposed of Marilu's purse by throwing it right in the water and watching it sink. But this is where the plan gets even more sinister and evil, if it wasn't already. It's getting later at this point, so he quickly dug a shallow grave and dumped her remains inside. Hardly a proper burial. A heartbreaking murder is the cause of her untimely death. Then a few days later, he gets worried because he's thinking that someone is going to stumble upon what he left below that shallow surface. He tells investigators he was starting to panic. He was thinking, oh my gosh, they're going to send cadaver dogs onto his family's property and they're going to dig up Marilu. So he went back there, dug her up himself before anyone else could, and then he took his time. He tied cinder blocks to Marilu's body before putting her on a kayak and bringing her to the middle of that lake, where he dropped her to her final resting place below the water surface. But he went a step further. He was so worried about getting caught that he got some roadkill and placed it where Marilu's body had been in that shallow grave. This would serve as a decoy just in case a dog were to signal in that area. And that must have been when that officer caught him. That night, he was stopped on the side of the road. That garbage bag was full of animal blood that they found at the car wash. He had picked up that possum, brought it back to the original grave as a distraction, as a decoy. He even drew a map of where he said he left Marilu. This is the actual drawing on the screen. He showed a bridge, a creek, the cottage, some houses, and then where it says 20 feet out, he wrote Marilu. Underneath her name, he wrote R.I.P. and drew a cross. Detective Grammatica wasted no time. While other detectives were taking care of David and hearing the rest of his confession, Grammatica raced out of there and put a dive team together, including himself. He got suited up and was ready to dive below the surface and look for Marilu. They drove out to that lake and got ready to reach its depths. But before they did, a fisherman called in. He had information about something peculiar he saw on his underwater navigation camera. The dive team, including Grammatica, dove in the direction the fisherman had told them to go. It was 30 feet deep, murky and foggy underneath that water, which made it very eerie to be going down there and looking for human remains. But as they got deeper, the water got clearer. Soon, it was clear enough that they could see Marilu. She was wrapped in sheets, and her long dark hair was floating out of the top. They found her purse too, and inside was her wallet, her passport, jewelry items, and the necklace. But all the diamonds were removed. David had even poured dirt inside the purse to weigh it down, and then tossed it into the lake. When he was confronted with the proof that the necklace was in the purse, he insisted his wife stole that necklace weeks before this. Weeks before the accident happened with Marilu. Typical of so many other criminals, he thought he was so smart. He thought this would fool detectives into thinking there was no real motive to that plan, to kill Marilu to take the necklace. He tried to separate the necklace from the story, so it looked like he merely wanted to be paid for the hot tub pump that he purchased, even though we know he was hiking up the price. The detectives didn't fall for his lies because, you know what doesn't lie? Marilu's body. The medical examiner confirmed that her death was a homicide. This was not an accident. She had been stabbed 5 times in the chest, and her throat was cut. 2 of those wounds went into her heart. How sad that the trailer that Roger helped David purchase for his business was where the love of his life took her last breath, where David Crowley callously tried to conceal his evil actions. Detective Grammatica had to break the news to Roger himself. There were no right words to say to this family. They lost their mother, their partner. As Roger was being informed, Sheriff Hackle told Marilu's sons, and it was overwhelming for these boys who had already lost their father. And now their mom was gone, and she had been murdered. One of them punched a hole in the wall. He was so upset. Roger couldn't cope. No one could hold it together. When Tanya found out, she got into her car and screamed over and over again. None of them could believe that they had been fooled by David. He seemed like such a nice person, but he was a monster. In June of 2008, David's case went to trial because he pleaded not guilty. He changed his entire story. He denied having any part in the murder. That's right. Instead, he actually tried to pin it on the one person, probably the only person kind enough to ever have helped him, and that was Roger. David asserted that he came to the house and saw Marilu holding her neck. That's when he turned and saw Roger. Roger walked up and stabbed her, and then he instructed David to help him with the body. So he did. The problem for David was that he confessed to his own mother, who eventually told the cops exactly what she had been told, and it was recorded as well. He tried to get that evidence thrown out. Of course he did. He said he was being coerced, and so was his mother. But the jury wasn't buying it. On June 9, 2008, David Wright was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole for larceny, kidnapping, and felony murder. Marilu's family couldn't believe that a person could have that much greed, that they would take the life of a mother, or anyone for that matter, for money. Their mother was gone out of nowhere, and they wanted to make it clear how shocking this was. You never know what the next day will bring. She was just there, and then she was gone. You don't know how precious something is until it's not there anymore. Sadly, Roger couldn't handle what happened. His health continued to decline, and he passed away just months after this happened in November of that same year. However, he always took care of Marilu's sons. He made sure they were given money as part of a settlement agreement that he had to enter into with his own biological children. That was completely separate from this case, but that's the type of man he was. He made sure that Marilu's boys were taken care of in that settlement agreement. It addressed cars, jewelry, and money, in addition to an insurance policy that he obtained for Marilu. This case, like so many others, is just so sad because we think about someone like Marilu and we think about someone in our lives that reminds us of her, or someone like Roger. You never know when their last day will come, and I think my message today is the same as Marilu's sons. They said you never know what tomorrow brings, so hold your loved ones close. Don't take a minute for granted. Being a high school teenager means cheering for your team, laughing in class, snapping selfies with your best friend, sharing dinner with your family, and discovering love for the first time. High school is a mix of highs and lows for everyone. But for 2 teenage girls, life took a devastating turn when a killer stepped through the open gate. South Africa is beautiful. It has oceans, canyons, mountains, deserts, and tons of wildlife. I'm talking elephants, whales, and yes, even penguins. South Africa is also a country with a long and fraught history. It was originally colonized by the Dutch in the mid-1600s, occupied by the British until the 1900s, and under brutal apartheid until 1994. That is when Nelson Mandela was elected as the first president representing the African National Congress. South Africa is divided into provinces, and today's case is set in the province of Northwest, in a tiny cattle farming town called Stella. The name Republic of Stellaland was coined in 1882 after a war was fought on the territory. A group of white mercenaries who won the war were given farmland as their war prize, and 150 years later, most of the land has been passed down through families for generations. The entire country is only 7% white, and only 14% of the population speaks Afrikaans as their first language, which I find fascinating. However, the population of Stella itself is 70% white Christians who speak Afrikaans, which is the third most spoken language in South Africa after Zulu, the most popular language, and Xhosa, which is the second most popular. Stella is on National Route 18 between Mafeking, the capital of Northwest, and the city of Vryburg. It has around 1,000 residents, mostly cattle farmers, one pub, one primary school, and one secondary school, so it is quite a small community comparatively speaking. Every October, the community holds a county fair called Beesfees. The Beesfees brings a lot of tourism. People come from all over to watch rugby matches, attend cattle auctions, and see farming presentations. The rest of the year, Stella is pretty quiet. People don't lock their doors. The only fences in town are to keep the livestock in safe places on the land. And just like every small town, there are systemic problems: gender violence, racism, and of course, gossiping neighbors. But Stella overall is known as a great place to grow up. Everybody knows one another, everyone looks out for each other, and it's known as a great place to raise children. As an American, it helps me to think of Stella as similar to a Midwest rural community here in the United States, where everyone knows everyone, and it takes a village to raise a child, as they say. So it's nice to have a close-knit community. We're going to be learning about two young women in this case and how their paths crossed. I'll start with Marna Engelbrecht. She was born in 2001 and grew up outside of Stella, on her dad's farm. This is part of the Vryburg district. The city of Vryburg has a population of about 63,000 people, and people who live in Stella will drive from Stella to Vryburg to do their shopping and business. Marna's dad, Stefanis, was a farmer whose job was to bore holes to create wells on people's farms. He trained farmhands and was well respected in their community. Marna's mother, Rihanna, was a kindergarten teacher in Kamjesgrun, and she was a strong woman who loved children. They welcomed their first daughter, Rihanna, 2 years after Marna was born. Marna and Rihanna actually looked like twins, with their big hazel eyes, tan skin, and long, straight, side-parted dark hair. It was clear that they were related. Sometimes it was hard to tell them apart. Marna was very family-oriented and particularly close with her dad. His nickname for her was Marna Muis, which is the Afrikaans word for mouse, because Marna was adorable, shy, and loved animals. Marna went to a nursery school in Kamjesgrun, which is a town close to Stella, and primary school in Vryburg. She was a bookworm, very polite and hardworking as a student, but when she got out of class, she spent all of her time outdoors. She loved bottle feeding their baby goats, sheep, and cows, and playing with her dogs, including the family dog, Nero. They also had horses, and by the time Marna was a teenager, she had convinced her father, Stefanis, to enroll her in horseback riding lessons. She had her very own horse, and Marna loved to feed it sugar cubes, which I think is adorable. From day one, Marna wanted to spend the rest of her life with animals, because let's face it, a lot of times they're just better than humans. She planned to become a veterinarian. Sometimes her family would be driving home from school, and Marna would see an injured animal on the side of the road, and she would beg them to pick it up so she could nurse it back to health. She was smart, quick-witted, but also stubborn, and you couldn't tell Marna no. She always stood up for what she thought was right and what she wanted. When Marna reached grade 8, she enrolled in Stella High School. Now I know it's different than here in the States, where high school begins in the 9th grade, but there weren't many secondary schools for rural kids to attend, so this school became the South African equivalent of a private boarding school. 5 days a week, boys and girls would go to school and stay overnight in 2 separate hostels. The girls stayed in Heesterhuizen, a 2-story building with a common room, communal bathrooms, and shared bedrooms. Here's what the bathrooms look like. Lots of sinks and showers in a row. The rooms look like this: A simple twin bed, some furniture accents, and another example with a bed and a desk. Here's the front entrance to the girls' dormitory. The entryway to the boys says man cave. There's also a stairway to the second story. Here's an example of one of the boys' rooms. You can decorate it a bit to make it feel like home, but on the weekends, kids are picked up by their parents and driven back home, sometimes over an hour away. Here's what the campus looks like from a bird's eye view, and here's what the front looks like where the gates open and close. After hours, it's secured with a fence that includes barbed wire on top, and it's in the middle of a lot of farmland. Not much goes on around the actual school, but they have a lot to do there. They have nice sports facilities and tennis courts, all along a dirt road. The students all wear uniforms, the girls in blue skirts and button-down shirts, some with ties or vests, and the boys in blue jackets. There is a lot to do on campus: events, themed parties to celebrate different accomplishments, holidays, and of course athletic events. There are so many athletic activities on campus that it's unbelievable. These kids are very active, and that's the point of this boarding school, to get kids off their phones, off the computer, and to have them being social with one another, while also focusing on fitness and things like that. The residences on campus house 71 residents, of which about half are boys and half are girls, so about 32 are boys and 39 are girls, in two separate boarding houses, which are private from one another, of course, with rules about when boys and girls can come together at their respective hostels and hang out. Marna was shy and introverted. She was also petite and often overlooked, but that first year of high school, she became one of the stars of her class, literally. Stella's honor system was called the Order of the Star, and it functioned like the Olympics. Every quarter of the year, the top scholars in each grade got a gold, silver, or bronze medal for their achievements, which really did encourage them to work hard. Marna got the bronze medal several times. She studied hard and excelled in science and math. She began hanging out with a girl in her grade, and this is the second young woman I'll be introducing you to in this case. Her name is Charnel. Charnel was Marna's complete opposite, but you know what they say, opposites attract. Charnel had blonde hair, big green eyes, and a really bright and beautiful smile. She was very outgoing. Marna and Charnel clicked like puzzle pieces, though it was no surprise because they actually already knew each other. It turns out Rihanna, Marna's mom, had played songs during Charnel's parents' wedding reception back in the day. Marna and Charnel actually went to the same daycare and had been best friends at the age of 3. But over the years, they lost contact throughout elementary school. Once reunited at Stella, Marna and Charnel spent every waking hour together. They became roommates in one of the hostels, which is like a dorm room at Stella. They went to each other's homes every weekend, and Marna met everyone in Charnel's extended family. They hiked together, rode horses, fished, played netball, hung out on the farm, and recorded videos on their phones. The girls would lip-sync to popular Vines. You guys remember Vines? And they would use SpongeBob voice filters, then break into laughter. The girls had a lot of fun together and were like typical teenagers. Marna was known for her sense of humor, which she got from her dad, Stephanos. She would make jokes on her Instagram and Facebook and leave it to her dad. He would always comment on her posts in Afrikaans. For example, Marna posted a selfie with Charnel and Stephanos commented, "Let's see who the dads are. They must be pretty handsome." I think you can understand their humor. By the time Marna and Charnel reached the 11th grade, they were a package deal. Whenever you saw one, you saw the other. It was expected that they would always be together. Marna actually said, "We've been friends for so long, I can't remember which one of us is the bad influence." They were always joking and laughing together. I'm going to take this opportunity to tell you more about Charnel. She was born on March 8, 2001, to Ronnie and Sanja. Charnel's nickname was actually Lala or Lai. She went by both, and her Instagram handle was Charnel_Lai. In North Africa, Lala means lady or queen, so perhaps it was related to that. And in other cultures, L means you talk a lot. You tell me if you're from South Africa, and I've heard this nickname and can offer a meaning. Chanel was the only child, and she grew up on her father Ronnie's farm in Delaville. Ronnie grew potatoes, owned cattle, and was a feed supervisor. Ronnie would make food for animals, take samples, and then send them to labs to ensure quality control. He managed several employees and was in charge of inventory. He was a busy guy, so busy that he and his wife Sona ended up getting a divorce when Charnel was quite young. Despite their parents' separation, Charnel had a very strong relationship with both of them. Sona ended up moving to a town called Coster, where she worked at a holiday resort, and on weekdays, Charnel lived at Ronnie's farm. Growing up, every Sunday, she would have a long phone call with her mom, and 1 week a month, she would drive the 3 hours to Coster so she could hang out and have mother-daughter time. Ronnie ended up getting remarried, and his new wife's name was Anna. She had a son named Eston, who was 7 years younger than Charnel. Charnel had always wanted a younger sibling, so she and Eston spent their days outside, fishing and playing sports, while Charnel talked his ear off. Another reason I think Loli could have meant talkative. The closest person Charnel had to a sister was her cousin Lenari, who was 3 years older. They made lip-syncing videos together, just like with Marna. That was the cool thing to do in 2014, and honestly, not much has changed with TikTok these days. When Charnel went to Stella High, which was 45 minutes away from her father's farm and 2 hours away from Coster where her mom lived, Ronnie was sad that his little girl would be gone 5 days out of the week. But Charnel loved being independent. However, she also loved her family, so her stepmother would pick her up every Friday like clockwork. Charnel would walk in the door and say, "What's for dinner?" And then she would spend the rest of the night with her dad. When Charnel reconnected with Marna, Ronnie was thrilled. Having Marna in the house was like having a second daughter around. The girls were so close that when Charnel would go to bed at her house and Marna was there spending the night, Marna would go downstairs to chat with her family. Lenari said that Marna and Charnel were hilarious. They always cracked each other up, and everyone else as well. Charnel was also very popular. She was gorgeous, and she stood out with her long blonde hair and deep tan because she spent a lot of time outdoors in the sun. She loved hiking, horses, and taking pictures of nature. She actually wanted to be a professional photographer. Her dad thought she should be a model, that she should be in front of the camera, but Charnel wasn't interested. She thought that would involve a lot of traveling. Charnel wanted to stay close to her friends and family. She was sporty, sweet, good-natured, and had a childlike enthusiasm for everything she did. She was very spontaneous and saw the best in others. Charnel was also a people-pleaser, which could be seen as a flaw. She didn't like conflict, so she had a tendency to prioritize others before herself to keep things drama-free. Marna and Charnel were a lot alike. They were best friends after all, but they were fundamentally different. Marna was quiet, funny, and had a stubborn streak, while Charnel was bubbly, bright, and agreeable. I think in some cases there's a tendency to call two best friends the girls, but I'm really trying not to blend them together because it's important that you know them as two individual people and get to know Marna and Charnel for who they were. But the more time you spend with someone, the more you do take on some of their characteristics. In March of 2017, 16-year-old Charnel met 17-year-old Xander Bilesma. Charnel liked that Xander was tall, thought he was handsome, and liked that he played rugby. He was quiet and mysterious, but when you got to know him, he was charming. Xander was immediately infatuated with Charnel and treated her like a queen, doing anything for her. They started dating, and Charnel brought Xander home to meet Ronnie and her stepmom Anna, and they liked him. Xander was polite, respectful, and helped out around the farm. Charnel's cousin, Lenari, noticed that Xander would do anything for Charnel. If she called him and he was an hour's drive away, it didn't matter. He would drop everything to come meet her. They also liked that Xander was close with his mom, Mara, and that they went to the same church, a Dutch Reformed church. The families were actually pretty close, and funny enough, Xander was related to Charnel's BFF, Marna. Yes, it's a coincidence, but Xander's mom, Mara, was cousins with Marna's mom, Renette. That meant Xander was Marna's second cousin. But just so I'm not confusing anything, he's not dating his second cousin. Marna is not the one dating Xander, it's Charnel. Just wanted to clear that up before you thought that's where I was going with that. Growing up, Marna never actually hung out with her second cousin, but now that Charnel and Xander were together, all three of them were inseparable. Of course, Marna approved of Charnel's choice in a boyfriend since Xander was her cousin and all that. So I'll give you the rundown on Xander. Xander's parents, his mom's name was Mara and his dad's name was Monty, used to be in law enforcement. Mara worked in farm administration. They got divorced when Xander was in elementary school and he moved to Monty's farm near Freiburg. When Xander met Charnel, he was finishing up his senior year, which is known as the matriculate year, or matric, in South Africa. He liked fishing, hunting, wearing camo a lot, and Charnel thought his style was cute. They often engaged in deep conversations about growing up with divorced parents and their plans for the future. But after about 6 months of dating, the honeymoon phase was over, and Charnel started to see cracks in the relationship. Xander could come off as a bit possessive. He didn't like it when Charnel hung out with her friends instead of him, and Marna was confused as to why Charnel wasn't inviting her over on the weekends anymore. She felt like Xander was kind of isolating Charnel from her loved ones. When Marna learned that Xander would actually check Chel's phone to see who she was texting, she got worried. It seemed like there were some major trust issues in their relationship. Charnel then confided in Marna that, even though she loved Xander, she wasn't sure it was going to work out. After giving it a lot of thought, she decided it would be best if they broke up. I mean, he was leaving high school, she was still going to be there, and she was feeling a little smothered. So she finally let him know how she was feeling and broke it off with Xander. But of course, Xander apologized. He said this was his first serious relationship, and if she took him back, they could make it work. He promised to work harder to make sure things turned out better. So Charnel agreed, but over time the relationship became on again, off again, back and forth. Xander still acted jealous and controlling. Charnel decided the relationship was toxic, but every time she tried to break it off, Xander apologized. They both truly cared for and loved one another. It's hard when you're young. It's really hard to make that decision on what to do. You don't really want to lose the person, but you also know that maybe it's not the best. At Stella High, there's a very big ceremony called Matric Farewell for the seniors, basically prom. Each year there's always a theme, and students spend a lot of time decorating and preparing. The girls dress up really fancy, the men in sharp-looking suits, and they pull up in fancy cars. Xander and Charnel were on during this period. So when Xander invited Charnel to be his date, she happily agreed. It would be an exciting occasion because it wasn't her time yet. It was Xander's, and she was excited to go. In September of 2017, Charnel went to Coster to pick out a dress with her mom. She found one that she was obsessed with. She felt like Cinderella dressing up for the ball, which really sounds perfect for this event considering some of the dresses from previous years. When Charnel told Xander she had already bought a dress, Xander was kind of put off by it. He told her he had already designed and custom-made a dress for her because he didn't want her to worry about the little details. Xander asked Charnel to show up in her regular clothes without makeup or jewelry, and Charnel agreed. She showed up without her magical dress. It was still hanging in her closet. Then Xander's mom, Misha, did Charnel's hair and some light makeup. The new dress was actually beautiful. It was a black lace dress. I have a picture of Charnel wearing it, and Xander in his blue suit jacket, and they look stunning. The theme that year was Around the World. They decorated with things like the Eiffel Tower and the Statue of Liberty. As students came in through the red carpet, they were actually boarding a plane, Air France. You can see it in the background of the picture. Xander and Charnel made their way toward the event. Some of the students putting on the event were dressed as flight attendants and captains, and the sign said, Gate 12, now boarding. Inside, each table was decorated as a different country. It appears from the sign outside that Xander and Charnel sat at the London table. I also think that Xander's parents were in attendance. I think the parents of all the seniors actually come to this event, but they don't sit at the same table. His parents were sitting at the Egypt table. They had a great night. There's somewhat of a fashion show at this event where everyone shows off their outfit. Here's the couple coming inside arm in arm. Later, Xander was on stage, but I didn't see a picture of Charnel, so I was thinking it was just the graduating class that walks the catwalk while the crowd blows bubbles. For many young women, occasions like this, like dressing up for homecoming or prom, are usually more fun than the actual event itself. Getting ready with your friends, doing your hair and makeup. And Charnel was independent. She had no problem dressing herself or picking out her own special dress. So Xander's actions actually rubbed her the wrong way. It seemed like a sweet gesture, but given the history of Xander's possessiveness and jealousy, it could have been a way to make sure she wasn't dressed in a way he didn't approve of. Sure enough, the rest of 2017 saw Charnel and Xander's relationship rapidly go downhill. They started having fights about none other than her makeup and clothing. But through all of this, Charnel was always positive. She never said anything bad about Xander to her parents or her friends. Eventually, Charnel confided in her best friend, Marna, that she wasn't happy. Marna told Charnel to break up with Xander for good, to get it over with. He's not good for you. In December, Charnel posted on Facebook. She said, "When you give your heart to someone, remember to keep a piece for yourself too." And in January, she ended her and Xander's 11-month relationship. Charnel was actually finally over him. He was old news. But Xander was in denial that the relationship was truly over. He graduated in December, but he still called and texted Charnel every day. Sometimes he would show up at Stella High to talk to her. She didn't block him or anything like that because she didn't think it would do anything but make him upset. However, she felt like Xander was starting to act kinda crazy, and she felt like she dodged a bullet. Over time, Charnel and Marna started hanging out with other groups of friends, including their friend Brandon Victor, another rugby player from Stella. They'd known each other since they were 13. Brandon was in his senior year. He was handsome, smart, and athletic. It was known to almost everyone that Brandon had a crush on Charnel, but he never wanted to be disrespectful, ruin her relationship with Xander, or hurt their friendship. So he always tried to keep it quiet. Now that Charnel was single and spending time with Brandon, she started having feelings for him. She trusted him and confided in him when Xander wouldn't leave her alone. Brandon was patient and protective throughout the whole thing. Though, like most rugby players, he definitely had a rough streak. Charnel was cautious. She didn't want to jump into anything new, so she tried to let things grow naturally, which they did. By May of 2018, Brandon and Charnel started holding hands and were more than friends, but they weren't ready to admit it to everyone. Charnel wasn't exactly 100% over Xander. It happens, it takes time. She told Marna she missed Xander, explaining that he made her heart race 1,000,000 kilometers an hour. But Marna told her that a good relationship would make her heartbeat feel normal, because sometimes it's the lust that keeps people together, even in a toxic relationship. When Charnel asked if she should date Brandon, Marna approved. This meant a lot because at first, Marna was happy that Charnel was dating Xander, but over time, she no longer approved of him at all. With her best friend's support, Charnel felt like she was moving in the right direction. In South Africa, high schools have 4 quarters, and the second quarter runs from the beginning of April to mid-June. So on May 25, 2018, it was an average Friday for 18-year-old Brandon, 16-year-old Marna, and 17-year-old Charnel. They were in the middle of classes and rugby season. Brandon was going to Coster that weekend with the boys' rugby team for a game, and he invited both girls to ride on the school bus and watch the game. Charnel figured this was a great opportunity to visit her mom as well, hang out with Brandon, and spend the weekend with her best friend. It was perfect, and Brandon was thrilled that Charnel wanted to join. So on Saturday after the game, he had a plan. He was finally going to ask Charnel to be his official girlfriend. The afternoon of the 25th, Rihanna drove home from Camille Kindergarten and stopped by Stella High School to see her daughter. Marna had told both of her parents she wasn't actually going to come home that weekend, so her mom figured she would at least come by to say hello. When she got there, she stayed in the car, and Marna came outside the hostel. They chatted for just a moment, and then Marna waved goodbye as Rihanna drove back to the farm. Little did she know that that was going to be the last time she would ever see her daughter alive. Marna and Charnel grabbed dinner together that night, and then they packed for the weekend. They hung out in their bedroom on the ground floor of the hostel, which was empty because everyone was gone on the weekends. People don't usually stay there. They were the only girls going to the rugby game. Everyone else had gone home. Marna and Charnel chatted for hours, and they were jumping up and down on the beds. They were just having a great time together, and that's when Charnel got a call from her dad, Ronnie. When Charnel picked up the phone, he could hear the girls cracking up in the background. Ronnie remembers them this way: happy, carefree, and excited for a weekend sleepover. After they got off the phone, Charnel and Marna visited the hostel mom, Christelle Yasta, who lived on the premises. Christelle agreed to wake them up at 6 o'clock in the morning so they could get ready to get on the bus. The bus would depart sharply at 6:30 from the boys' hostel, which is a short walk away. So, Charnel and Marna asked Christelle to keep the hostel gate open that night. Every night, it's usually locked closed, and of course, they wouldn't have the key. They wanted the option to go on a spontaneous walk that night, so Christelle agreed. As a hostel mom, she'd seen a lot of things in her time and knew Marna and Charnel were responsible students. She trusted that they would be back at a reasonable hour. The gates were kind of a formality anyway. It's not hard to climb over them if someone really wanted to get in. It's just a signal that things are closed and to keep everything secure. So she went and unlocked the gate, and then went to bed. As for Charnel and Marna, they hung out, drank coffee in the common room, but by 11:30, they were bored. The night was still young in their opinion, so Charnel texted Brandon and invited him over. Brandon got permission from the hostel dad on their side to keep the gate open to the boys' dorm, so he was able to go over to the girls' hostel and hang out for a bit while the adults slept. They partied into the early morning hours. Charnel's mom, Sanja, was an early riser and woke up in Costa around 6 o'clock in the morning. When she checked her phone, she saw a text from her daughter. Charnel wrote in Afrikaans, "Mommy, I just wanted to say that I love you, Mommy, and I'm sorry." The thing is, the word sorry was spelled wrong. Sanja looked at the time that this text message was sent, 4:17 a.m. She wondered what in the world Charnel was doing awake at that hour, and why she would be apologizing. Something seemed off. Charnel never misspelled words. She always checked to make sure her texts were spelled correctly, and she never sent a text at 4 o'clock in the morning. Sanja tried calling her daughter multiple times, but Charnel never answered. All the calls actually went to her voicemail. Sanja knew that Charnel was supposed to be getting ready to go on the bus by now, so she was just hoping that Charnel was busy brushing her teeth or packing her bag, but she was worried. So she called her ex-husband Ronnie and asked him if Charnel was still visiting. Ronnie actually woke up to this phone call. The phone was ringing, and Ronnie picked up. He told Sanja he talked to Charnel the night before, and Charnel would be in Costa. He reassured her that everything was fine, and they ended the call. That's when Ronnie went to his phone and saw multiple text messages from Charnel. The first was at 3:42 a.m. It was a picture of his daughter wearing a bra with no shirt, with a caption, "I love you, Brandon," which was quite an embarrassing thing to send your dad, and also it was sent so early in the morning. The second text was at 4:17 and said in Afrikaans, "Daddy, I'm sorry. Marna and I are leaving this place." Ronnie felt his heart fill with dread. Leaving this place sounded odd. Were they leaving the hostel? What in the world was going on? It almost sounded like the girls might have been intoxicated or something. At 6:15 that morning, Ronnie called the headmaster of Stella High School, Richard Hobson. Hobson had actually just learned the news and told Ronnie that Charnel and Marna were dead. I can't even imagine thinking everything was okay, getting these really weird text messages, and then getting a message like that, just point blank, the girls are not alive. The hostel mom, Christelle, had woken up the morning of the 26th just before 6 a.m. She put on her jacket, left her bedroom, and passed the communal bathroom. Outside the bathroom, she noticed a strange clump of dark hair on the floor. But in her morning haze, she looked at it and couldn't figure out what it was. Did it come from a brush? What was it doing there? So she kept walking. Near the bathroom was a staircase between the first and second floors. It was a hovering staircase that formed a balcony over an alcove. In the alcove were pink couch cushions where girls could sit and hang out. There was a stack of mountain bikes leaned up against each other on the underside of the staircase. The stair rail was pink, and the panel underneath the stairs was also painted pink. Christelle rounded the staircase, and that's when she noticed a long green nylon rope tied to the stair railing. What she saw next made her freeze. Dangling inches above the stack of bicycles were a pair of white-socked feet, a long pair of pants, and above that, hanging lifelessly, was Charnel. Christelle couldn't move. She was in complete shock and just stood there for a minute, frozen by horror and devastation. She snapped herself out of it and ran outside to find help. The boys' hostel gate was open. The rugby players were milling around, eating breakfast and gathering equipment. Christelle was banging on the hostel dad's door. She couldn't even explain to him what was going on and didn't want any of the rugby players to find out, not before the police arrived. When the hostel dad saw Charnel hanging by the staircase, he knew this was not something she could have survived. Charnel had clearly taken her own life, but it just didn't make sense. Both of them knew Charnel. She was vivacious, talkative, and loved her life. So they wondered, had she been hiding thoughts of depression? What would have driven her to this point? It was devastating, unbelievable, and confusing. The hostel dad called 911 and reported that one of the students had taken her own life. At this point, with all the chaos, they decided not to alert Marna or even try to find out where she was that morning. They figured she was asleep in her room, but later, when they checked, she wasn't there. When Christelle waited for the South African Police Service, SAPS, the house dad found Brandon and asked him if he knew Marna's phone number. Brandon had a bad feeling. He asked the house dad if Marna and Charnel were okay, but the house dad wouldn't say. When Brandon got on the bus and noticed that Charnel and Marna weren't there, he was worried. He thought something might have happened, perhaps an accident. What if Charnel had been hurt and Marna went with her to the hospital? He asked his coach what was happening, but the coach told him he wouldn't be able to provide any details until they arrived in Koster. It was an excruciating 2-hour drive, and Brandon spent the entire time panicking. The Stella police station was literally half a mile away, so it did not take them long to start the investigation. Sergeant Zagaris Hum answered the call and arrived at 6:40 a.m. after calling for backup from the Freiburg PD. When Sergeant Hum approached, he introduced himself to the two adults standing outside. They told him that Charnel had taken her life on the stairs and that her best friend Marna was missing. Hum assessed the crime scene and then searched the building for Marna. He went through the entire upstairs floor and couldn't find her. Then he went to her bedroom on the downstairs floor and couldn't find her there either. But as he rounded the corner to where the bathroom was, he saw that clump of long brown hair on the floor outside of the bathroom. The sergeant entered the bathroom and saw a young woman slumped down on her knees, leaning away from the sink. It looked like she had been in an upright position, then fallen forward with her head against the floor. Around her neck was a long strap tied to one of the sink taps above her head. The strap looked like it belonged to a backpack or a handbag, and she had fallen forward due to her weight, causing the handle to snap. The scene was horrific, and Sergeant Hum assumed that Marna had also taken her own life. He wondered if she had seen her best friend and decided she could not live without her, or if it had been the opposite. It still didn't make sense. Most people in Stella grew up in religious households, and taking one's own life was considered a sin. Why would two young girls choose this fate? It was very concerning and unusual. Sergeant Hum called in the forensic investigators, and at this point, paramedics had arrived. They checked Marna's pulse, but found none. It was much harder for them to reach Charnel, and since this was a potential crime scene, they didn't want to touch anything to avoid contaminating the DNA. Though unlikely, they had to make sure that Charnel wasn't still breathing. The paramedics went halfway up the flight of stairs and, wearing gloves, touched the rope to move her closer. Sadly, Charnel had also passed away. Sergeant Hum had the horrible task of calling Charnel and Marna's families. They were half asleep, eating breakfast, when Stephanos heard the phone ring. He answered it, and the look on his face was like he had just seen a ghost. His wife knew right away that something was wrong. When Marna's mom, Rena, finally found her ringing phone, she frantically answered it. There was an officer on the other end telling her that her beloved daughter and her best friend had taken their lives. All three of them jumped in the car. Rihanna prayed to God for strength. She had now lost 2 daughters, and it was self-inflicted. That didn't make sense. Both girls were happy. They had their entire lives ahead of them. Why would they choose this? That was the question. When Marna's parents showed up, they rushed to find her. Her sister was there with her mom and dad. They were led to the bathroom, and when her mom took one look at Marna, she said, "No, this is murder." They say a mother always knows. And by the way, Marna's body was hunched over, placed with her head on the floor. It didn't look like she had fallen forward. It looked like someone had put her there, and Marna's mother was convinced of it. At the same time, Ronnie was making phone calls. He found out about the deaths from the head of the school. First, Ronnie called his brother Louis, the dad of Charnel's cousin Limari. Ronnie lived 45 minutes away from Stella, and Louis lived much closer. He asked his brother to please drive over to the high school and be there while paramedics and police arrived. Louis agreed and called Limari to tell her the news. Then Ronnie called Sanja. Sanja had been worried sick for 45 minutes and immediately picked up when Ronnie revealed that their daughter was dead. I can't even imagine the wall of grief that hit her, knowing she would never hear Charnel's voice on Sunday afternoons ever again. Sanja and Ronnie hopped in their cars and drove to the scene, though Sanja had a much longer drive ahead of her, 2 hours from Coster. Louis got there 20 minutes before anyone else and went inside to see Charnel. 2 more police officers had arrived and were calling this an unnatural death investigation. When Louis saw his niece still hanging by a rope, he asked the officers to please cut her down. It was a horrific way to see her, completely powerless, but the police refused. They said they had to wait until the forensic investigator showed up to rule out a potential homicide. Louis was so upset but decided to wait for his brother to get there and make a decision. When Ronnie showed up and Charnel was still dangling in the air, can you even imagine? He was outraged. He demanded that the police take her down, and when they wouldn't, he asked Louis to help him because he was going to take matters into his own hands. I don't blame him. I could not bear to see someone like that, let alone my child. They moved the bikes out of the way and removed the wall cushions from underneath the stairs. Louis went up the stairs and cut the rope. Charnel was lowered into Ronnie's arms. Ronnie sank to the ground, running his hands through his daughter's hair as the police looked on. They didn't want to interfere with this grief, even though there was a good chance that Ronnie's DNA would be all over the scene. It makes me sad that anyone has to worry about fingerprints and DNA when their daughter has just died. It adds insult to injury, but at the same time, I can respect and understand how important it is for the scene not to be contaminated. Ronnie accepted that the police had to continue their investigation. He sat Charnel down on the cushions and went to see Marna's body and to stand with Marna's mom, dad, and sister. He noticed that Charnel, when he brought her down, was significantly warmer than Marna. Ronnie told the police this, and they took note of the observation. As the family stood outside the girls' hostel waiting for answers, Brandon was on that bus riding to Coster. He texted and called Charnel over and over, but she never picked up. When they arrived at the rugby field, the coach lined up all the players. Brandon sat horrified as his coach told them that Marna and Charnel had died of what they were saying were unnatural causes. But that was it. No explanation, no details. What did it mean to die unnaturally? Brandon felt not only sick to his stomach but heartbroken. Tonight was the night he was going to ask Charnel to be his girlfriend. He had been waiting over a year for that moment, and now it was ripped away from him. Brandon didn't know the allegations that the girls had taken their own lives. He thought it was just unnatural causes, like something happened to them. If he did hear it was self-inflicted, he didn't believe it for a moment. He had been hanging out with the girls 6 hours before this. To him, unnatural meant it was murder. Brandon called Ronnie and told him that he suspected Xander right away. At 11:30 the night before, Brandon had gone to Charnel and Marna's bedroom. He told her dad they held hands, danced to music, and Charnel even was helping him get rid of some acne on his back. Brandon was having a great time, but Charnel's phone kept ringing and getting text alerts. It was blowing up non-stop. So he asked her who was messaging, and Charnel said it was Xander. They tried their best to ignore it, but the phone calls were distracting. At midnight, Charnel finally answered, putting the phone on speaker. Marna and Brandon went completely silent, just listening. Xander's first words were, "Are you alone?" Charnel said yes. Xander said he didn't believe her and asked her to walk into a different room. So Charnel walked out of the bedroom and right back in, making sure her footsteps were as loud as possible so Xander would think she was by herself. Then Xander asked if she wanted to go out for a late-night meal, and Charnel said no. Xander asked if he could return some of her clothes, and again, Charnel said no. She would just send Ronnie to pick up her clothes from Monty's farm. But Xander said he was going to be busy for the rest of the week and wasn't sure when he would see Charnel again, so he invited himself over to the hostel, asking if the gate was open. Brandon described the scared look on Charnel's face when she realized the gate was open. She said the gate was locked and told Xander not to come over, but Xander would not take no for an answer. He said he would break open the gate if he had to. Charnel told Xander that if he was so insistent on bringing the clothes, Marna could actually go meet him downstairs at the window. Then Xander called her a name, and right before he hung up, he said, "You're gonna be sorry when you see what I do tonight." Those words scared Charnel. She actually started to cry. Brandon knew that when Xander had been in a relationship with Charnel, he had threatened to take his own life if she ever left him. He'd done this to manipulate her into staying with him, and now they figured he was threatening to hurt himself again. Brandon offered to stay over in Charnel's room and take the backlash or punishment from the hostile mom. He also suggested they wake up the hostile mom and lock the front gate, but Charnel told him not to worry. If Xander showed up, she would just stay in her room and ignore him. At that point, Marna, Brandon, and Charnel were all scared but tired. They had to get up in just a few hours, so Brandon reluctantly left. Charnel insisted everything was going to be okay and told him everything would be fine. Brandon told all of this to Charnel's dad, Ronnie, over the phone. Ronnie was overwhelmed with emotion and thanked Brandon for reaching out. Ronnie knew Charnel liked Brandon and also knew that Charnel had been in a toxic relationship with Xander. But Brandon had been the last person to see both Marna and Charnel alive, so Ronnie wondered if Brandon was lying about Xander's phone call to maybe remove a target from his back. Was Xander really capable of murder? Ronnie wasn't sure what to believe. Meanwhile, the forensic investigators showed up at the scene and began gathering evidence. They collected the clump of dark hair that was lying on the ground, as well as Charnel and Marna's phones. They swabbed the staircase rails, the bathroom sinks, the front door to the hostel, the girls' phones, and surfaces throughout their bedrooms. They analyzed the rope and the handbag strap. It was anyone's guess as to what happened here. Had Charnel and Marna let someone in, and that person ended up harming them, or did they have a pact to end their own lives? Captain Marcus Ferreira was assigned to the case, representing the South African police. He learned from talking to Christelle that the gates to the boys' and girls' hostels were both left open overnight. If this wasn't a pact, then this was a double homicide. It could have been anyone, a rugby player, a random stranger, or someone in the girls' inner circle. Stella High School knew that the gates had been opened, which could mean they could be sued by Marna and Charnel's families for negligence. So, the headmaster, Hobson, panicked and decided to call a private investigation firm in Hartswater. PI Christopher Saunders was assigned to the case. He was hired to find out what happened and to serve justice, but at the end of the day he was working for the headmaster and was going to do everything possible to prove Stella was not responsible for these deaths. The families were still outside the hostel, speculating about what had happened. All of them thought this was murder. When Ronnie got the phone call from Brandon, he repeated Brandon's story to the group. He told them what Xander had said, that they would be sorry when they saw what he did that night. Stephanos heard this and recalled a conversation he had with Marna in March of that year. Marna had told him that Xander was stalking Charnel, even though they had broken up. He no longer went to Stella, but he would show up there, and Marna always came to Charnel's defense. She even texted Xander that if he didn't leave her best friend alone, she would tell her parents about Xander's behavior and take all this information to the police. That's when Xander went off on Marna. He texted her insulting messages, left vulgar comments, and even referenced her genitals, which was inappropriate. He said Marna had too much control over Charnel's life and that she was the one who convinced Charnel to break up with him. He told Marna to stop messing with his relationship with Charnel or else. Marna showed Stephanos the text message chain, and Stephanos didn't like that Xander was threatening his daughter and calling her names. Though at this time he considered it just teenage drama, Marna said she was scared, so Stephanos decided to handle it himself. He called Xander and politely told him not to call his daughter names. Stephanos had met Xander several times, and the teen was always respectful. But this time Xander got angry with him. He cursed at Stephanos and yelled, "You can't tell me what to do." Xander even told him that if they didn't leave him alone, he would resolve this issue with his gun. Stephanos couldn't take him seriously. Using a gun over a breakup? When the call ended, he recommended 3 things: that Marna, Brandon, and Charnel should keep telling Xander no until he got the message and left her alone. And third, he said to let sleeping dogs lie. I think most of us know what he meant. Just try to ignore him. Don't fuel his fire. I don't like to judge people's advice to their children. After all, I don't think Stephanos thought this would truly escalate. Hindsight is always 20/20ths, and I'm guessing he hadn't been in this situation before. But now, standing outside the hostel, all Stephanos could think about was that conversation. Maybe Xander had followed through with his threat. Stephanos took the family car and headed in the direction of Xander's father's farm, with the full intent to confront and even shoot Xander if he had to. Since Xander had graduated, he had been living and working for his dad, so Stephanos knew where to find him. 10 minutes after Stephanos left, private investigator Chris Saunders arrived. He was given a full tour of the crime scene. Marna and Charnel had been taken to the hospital by now, but he was given a rundown on how they had been found. Then he interviewed Ronnie, Sanja, Rihan, and Rihanna. Detective Saunders learned about the strange text messages that Ronnie and Sanja had received earlier that morning, one of them mentioning Brandon by name. He also learned that nobody thought this was self-harm. Everyone thought the perpetrator was Xander. But everyone confirmed that Brandon had been the last person to see Marna and Charnel, which made him a person of interest. The only person missing was Stephanos, and all of them said he was going after Xander and had brought a gun. Rihanna was convinced that he was going to do something he would regret, so time was of the essence. Saunders took off for the farm, and when he got there, he turned on a voice recorder. As a private investigator, Saunders always did his best to collect as much evidence as possible. He wanted to document the day, remember his suspects and their alibis, but he never used these recordings as evidence in court. When Saunders pulled up outside the farmhouse, Stephanos and Monty were 30 minutes into a screaming match, and Xander was in a slumped position near the wall. Stephanos was brandishing his gun at both men, accusing Xander of murdering his daughter and her best friend. Now Saunders had to do his best to de-escalate the situation. He said he was law enforcement and not there to accuse Xander of murder. Instead, he wanted to make sure that Xander was safe. If the town of Stella thought Xander was responsible, he would be in danger. The police wanted to keep him safe and needed Xander's statement. Stephanos calmed down. He agreed that having Xander under the supervision of law enforcement was the right move, so he left. Xander agreed to go with Saunders into the police car, but he was walking slowly and seemed to be under the influence of something. Saunders asked Monty if it was normal for his son to be sleepy and slurring his words, and Monty said Xander was in shock. He asked if he could drive Xander to the station himself, but Saunders insisted that he drive him, and Monty understood that Saunders was only doing his job. Saunders promised to keep Xander safe. Then Monty said something concerning. He said he didn't have an alibi for Xander. He had seen his son leave at 6:30 p.m. on Friday night and come back to his farm at 6 o'clock Saturday morning, though he might have been at his mom's the whole night, so considering he didn't think he had an alibi, Monty asked if he should hire a lawyer. Saunders said yes. I've said this many times, but it's always smart to hire a lawyer, even if you're innocent. Xander sat in the back seat, and Detective Saunders began the long drive back to Stella while Monty followed behind in his car. Saunders asked Xander why he seemed intoxicated, and Xander just responded that he was stressed. He said Charnel's cousin Lamari called him at 7 o'clock in the morning and told him that Charnel and Marna had taken their own lives. Charnel had been the love of Xander's life, and Marna was his second cousin. He said he was just grieving. Saunders began using the Reed technique of interrogation. That's a three-step process, where the officer presents all the facts of the case, gives a psychological theory on why a perpetrator might have done this, and then the person being interviewed starts to open up and share. They present alternative questions. For example, the officer might ask, "Did you plan to kill the person? Or did it just happen in the heat of the moment?" I'm sure you've heard of this method from shows or real interviews. These kinds of questions imply guilt. In either case, the answer will produce a confession. The Reed method, when used on younger people, though, can result in false confessions, and I want you to keep that in mind as I relay this conversation. So Detective Saunders asked Xander to provide his alibi. Xander said that on Friday night he was bored. His closest friend worked abroad in the U.S., so Xander felt isolated. He visited another friend named Petey, and they drank together with some of Petey's Stella friends until about 10:15 that night. After Xander left Petey, he went to a convenience store known as a garage in South Africa to get some more beer. Xander's usual night routine was to go out to the remote fields where they were holding the BSFS, the county fair, and hang out alone, drinking and smoking. Xander said he stayed there until 3 o'clock in the morning. Then he drove to his mom's farm. His mom, Mirsa, was an administrative assistant for Camille Fontaine Farm in Freiburg. She coordinated a transportation business where trucks would come and go with animal feed. Xander drove to that gate, but it was locked. Xander said he knew that trucks came and went regularly, so he just waited a few hours, smoked outside the gate until it opened at 4 o'clock in the morning. He saw a Volvo truck come through the gate and took that opportunity to drive inside. He denied being anywhere near Stella High School that night and said the Volvo was his alibi. Xander was silent and then told Saunders that when Stephanus chewed him out, Stephanus mentioned a video of the crime scene. This is actually standard policy for investigators, to take a video documenting everything at the scene the way they found it. Xander said by bringing up this video, Stephanus was implying that the girls did not die by self-inflicted wounds, and that Xander was a murderer. Saunders agreed there was a video, and that's when Xander asked if he could see it. Saunders let him know it was illegal for him to show Xander that video. But why would Xander want to see a crime scene where his ex-girlfriend and his second cousin had died? It's kind of morbid, but maybe he thought he could offer an opinion since the investigator was asking him what he thought. Like, if a killer had done this, why do you think they would do it? Or how do you think this occurred? That's part of the Reed technique. Saunders told Xander to be honest with him. Did he really not go to the hostel that night? Xander said he didn't know. He claimed he wasn't sure what happened because there had been a few hours between drinking in the empty field and going to his mom's that were unaccounted for. Saunders asked, "Do you not remember, or do you not want to remember?" At this point, Xander started to fall asleep. Saunders told him to stay awake. This was important. That's when Xander switched his story. Now he said he had gone to Stella High School that night. He went to the girls' hostel to fix things with Charnel. He wasn't sure what time it was since he'd been drinking and didn't look, but we know that Brandon left in the early morning hours around 1 a.m., so it had to have been sometime afterward, maybe around 1:30 or 2 o'clock. Xander said that Charnel came out of her room to meet him and smoke. They sat on the staircase and started talking. That's when Charnel confessed to him that she was dating Brandon, but was still in love with Xander. Xander told Saunders that he asked her why she couldn't just be with him. She said that everyone in her life thought he was toxic and that the relationship wasn't good. She couldn't convince her friends or her family that they should be together. Xander said he was, of course, upset. He thought that Marna and Charnel's parents were standing in the way of their love. It was like Romeo and Juliet. Xander trailed off, and Saunders explained to him exactly how the girls had died. He said that Charnel was hanged with a green nylon rope and that Marna had the strap of a handbag around her neck. Saunders asked, "Did you hang Charnel?" Xander said no. Saunders asked, "Did you strangle Marna in the bathroom?" Xander again said no. He claimed to have left as soon as Charnel told him she was dating Brandon. Now we get to the accusatory interview tactics. Saunders told Xander he would need a good lawyer and urged him to tell the truth. Xander asked Saunders, "What would I need to say in order to get shot?" What I think he meant by this is, what do I have to say in order to be guilty so I could get this over with and they would just take care of me? Saunders said even if Xander confessed, he wouldn't be shot. He'd be safe. But Xander actually asked to be shot. Remember, he was grieving. He had just lost someone he was obsessed with. But was this more of him knowing more than he was letting on? Xander changed his story again. He said that between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., he was intoxicated and everything felt like a dream. He said he had a conversation with Charnel on the hostel stairs, and during that conversation, she got cold and went to get long pants from her bedroom. That's when Marna walked to the bathroom. Xander admitted he was mad at Marna. He felt she was the one standing between him and Charnel, convincing Charnel to date Brandon and not him. He said he noticed a handbag in the alcove, grabbed it, and followed Marna into the girls' bathroom. He said he saw Marna washing her hands in the sink, and that's when Xander admitted he punched her and grabbed her hair. Then he wrapped one of the handles of the bag around her throat and took her life. He then attached the strap to the sink to make it look like Marna had done this to herself. Wow, there are a lot of things he said in there that he wouldn't have known if he wasn't there. The hair being pulled, remember there was a clump of hair on the ground. The way that she was found, nobody told him that. Then he said he met Charnel on the stairs, and at that point she thought Marna was still in the bathroom. Xander said they again talked about Brandon, but Charnel refused to get back together with Xander. So that's when he punched Charnel in the chest, knocking the wind out of her, and then he strangled her by wrapping his arm around her neck. When she was unconscious, he tied a rope around her neck, dragged her to the railing, and with the rope he lowered her over the banister until she was hanging with her feet above the bikes. Xander said brutally, "And then I hanged her." Just like that. It was unbelievable. Xander went on to explain that Charnel wanted this. Well, that's what he said. He said that she told him that she'd accidentally sent her daddy a text that was intended to go to Brandon, and it was a photo of her just wearing a bra. Xander told Charnel that's why she shouldn't take pictures like that. It was shameful. Xander told Saunders that Charnel was embarrassed and ashamed, and now that she couldn't be with Xander, he said that she was too upset to stay on this earth. Saunders asked if Charnel wanted to die, and Xander said, "Yeah, she wanted me to kill her." So Saunders asked if that's why Charnel didn't scream to alert the hostel mom, and Saunders said yes. But remember, this is a theory, a technique, where he's kind of eliciting this confession, right? He's asking these leading questions, and Xander just gets to say yes or no. So he's just following the line of reasoning right here. Saunders then asked if Xander had gone through Charnel's phone that night and sent any messages, and Xander said no. That was what I was originally thinking. Maybe she accidentally sent it and he saw it. But it seemed more likely that this was sent by the perpetrator because it seemed so odd. But okay, there are a lot of inconsistencies in this story. First of all, Xander implies that Charnel didn't scream because she wanted to die, not because he had just punched her and knocked the wind out of her. Also, why was Marna's clump of hair outside the bathroom and not in the bathroom? Did Xander confront her outside and then bring her inside? How fast could he have done that for Charnel not to notice? Was Xander lying when he said he hadn't gone through her messages? After all, he had demanded her phone multiple times while they were dating. And if Xander really wanted to be shot for his actions, why didn't he just let Stephanus take care of it? South Africa doesn't have the death penalty, so there was no way for Xander to end his life. Xander sounded like he knew everything about the crime, but Saunders had just told him everything as well because he was asking questions, and all Xander had to do was say yes. Xander had also received a phone call from Lamari at 7 a.m., explaining how the girls had been found, and Stephanus had revealed a bunch of information when he was threatening him. Was Xander just making this up? And why would he do that if it wasn't him who killed them? Detective Saunders pulled into the Stella police station, glad that he'd recorded every minute of this conversation without Xander knowing. It wasn't an official interview, but it was a good starting point for the investigation, for sure. At this point, Saunders dropped Xander off with other officers who brought him in for an official confession. His dad, Monty, and his mom, Mara, waited at the police station. Police asked Xander if he wanted to speak to a lawyer, and he said no. He was happy to just do the confession. So now, on Saturday, May 26th, Xander confessed. He said, "Charnel told me that she no longer wanted to be on Earth and that she did not want to hurt other people. I then realized that she was asking me to help her take her life. We made an agreement that I had to find a way so that she didn't have to feel the pain. I put my arm around her throat to make her pass out. With the rope already around her neck, I just want to state that I tied the rope to the stairs when she was still alive and she was aware of it. Then Marna came up the stairs to go to the bathroom. I don't remember if I talked to her. I saw a handbag underneath the stairs. I picked it up and ran after Marna. While she was washing her hands, what I can remember is that I suffocated her." That was his statement. So we changed the story again because, in the story, Marna walked up right past her friend and didn't notice that she was hanging by the banister. He's got to be lying, but it didn't matter. He was arrested on 2 charges of first-degree murder and taken to the Roy Krum prison in Mafeking. The investigation was far from over. Detective Saunders started interviewing people close to Xander, including Petey. Petey, now known as Angel, had been present during a domestic fight between his parents in which his mother had actually died, and ever since, Petey was known for his aggression. Saunders was concerned because if this was the kind of person Xander was hanging out with, maybe Petey assisted Xander in the crime. But Petey said that Xander dropped him off at 10:15, and he'd been home the whole night. His cell phone records would prove it. Detective Saunders also interviewed Brandon. He was still a person of interest because he had been the last person to see Charnel and Marna alive. Saunders asked Brandon for his phone. He cooperated, and they went through all of his text messages with Charnel. Nothing was out of the ordinary. He was an understanding guy. He respected her boundaries and even offered to be there for her on the morning of May 26th. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Brandon and Charnel sent their last messages to one another. Brandon asked if Charnel was okay and offered to come back over to the girls' hostel. He could be her personal bodyguard against Xander, or Charnel could come over to the boys' dorm. Charnel said it was a bad idea. They could get in trouble. She insisted she was okay, and according to his phone records, Brandon's phone never left the boys' hostel until 6:30 in the morning. He was probably asleep after that because he had a big game the next day. Saunders heard Brandon's alibi once more, as well as the story he told Ronnie about Xander and Charnel's terrifying late-night phone call. Investigators fact-checked this with Charnel's phone. On Friday night, Charnel texted Brandon to stop by the girls' hostel and have coffee with them. She had about a dozen missed calls from Xander over the course of the night. She picked up one call after midnight, and this matched up with Brandon's story. Brandon also told police that in the months leading up to the crime, Xander would show up at Stella High School, randomly. Charnel told Brandon that she didn't want to meet up with Xander. She was tired of saying no, and him not taking no for an answer. Recently, she had told Xander that she was seeing Brandon, and Xander had actually called Brandon, so he kind of already knew this and tried to manipulate him into breaking up with Charnel so that he could be with her and just stay away from her. Brandon could see right through Xander's BS. He had liked Charnel for so long, and Charnel liked him back. He wasn't going to let Xander get in the way of a good thing. In the next few days, Charnel and Marna were given autopsies by forensic pathologist Dr. Trom Balls. Marna had several injuries. Some of her hair was pulled out, which is already evident from the clump found at the scene. That alone would suggest this was not self-inflicted. Her jaw was broken. Maybe she had even been punched in the face. As for the cause of death, it was ruled a homicide by strangulation. Marna had been throttled with the strap of a bag. It was not consistent with hanging, meaning Marna had been murdered and the strap had been tied to the tap after she died. Dr. L suggested that Marna was killed before Charnel. The bathroom was close enough to the stairs that Marna would have seen Charnel on her way to the bathroom. If Charnel was already dead and hanging from the banister, it was clear that there was a scuffle outside of the bathroom, which is why officers found some of Marna's hair there. Knowing Marna, she would have put up a fight, which it appeared she had. As for Charnel, Dr. L said she sustained blunt force trauma to her chest. The attacker hit her and used this opportunity to overpower her. Charnel had 2 strangulation wounds. The first was horizontal from something wider than a rope about the size of a forearm. The second was from the rope. This part is graphic, but it's the truth. The rope marks bruised her neck in multiple places. This meant that Charnel had been awake or woke up while she was hanging from the rope. She would have struggled at that point, and the other wounds show that she had tried to get herself down while the rope was cutting off her airway. For example, all of the fingernails on her right hand were broken, and most of the fingernails on her left as well. This was from trying to pry the rope from her neck. She had scratched her neck until it bled. How horrifying. There was also an injury to her nose and pressure to her head, which caused bleeding behind her eyes. I am horrified that this happened to her. Who knows how long she was hanging there, just scared and alone in her last moments. Both of their bodies were swabbed in order to find possible DNA from the perpetrator. When Detective Saunders heard the report, everything lined up. Xander could not have known Marna was punched in the face and Charnel was punched in the chest unless he was there. They had their killer behind bars. Now they needed to collect enough evidence to prevent him from ever being released. Police canvassed the neighborhood and put out a call for tips. A witness then came forward and claimed that they had seen Xander's car near the girls' hostel on Friday night. Police confirmed that no other girls, other than Marna and Charnel, were present at the hostel. At that point, the schoolgirls were given the opportunity to speak with counselors, but that didn't help the fact that their friends were gone. Can you imagine walking up and down those stairs and using that bathroom knowing what happened there? Then, they did put on a memorial at the school. I do have some photos of posters they put up, photos of both of the girls, and they were there to honor their memories. Meanwhile, analysts looked at the texts from Charnel's phone. From her parents, they knew that Charnel and Marna had been killed between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., and these text messages were sent at 4:17. They were from the perpetrator. So the police department looked into Xander's Volvo alibi. If Xander was home at 4 a.m., like he said, then they had arrested the wrong guy. They went to Masha's farm and located the exact Volvo truck that Xander was talking about. It was company policy to install tracking devices inside all their vehicles to record the mileage and assess business costs. Officer F found out that the Volvo was turned on at 4:02 a.m. driver. He was on his way to Freiburg by 4:30. Masha's farm was 40 minutes away from Stella, so if a fake text was sent at 4:17 by Xander, then he would have gotten back from the hostel at 5 a.m. If he was at Stella, how did he know the Volvo was leaving at 4? Did he pass it on the way to his mom's, or did he contact his mom and she created an alibi for him? Or maybe he was home the whole time. It seemed unlikely, but anything was possible. So police dug into Xander's personal life. Xander was born on May 13, 1999, to Masha and Monty BMA in Hartswater, a part of the Northern Cape. Masha spent years trying to have a child. She miscarried several times, and during Xander's pregnancy she actually contracted German measles, also called rubella. Doctors recommended that Masha terminate this pregnancy, but this was her miracle baby. She couldn't give him up. When Xander was born, he was small and sickly, but he ended up making a full recovery. Masha thought he was a gift from God and she would do anything for him. Xander was a mama's boy, and everyone knew it. When Xander's parents divorced, it was very hard for him to cope. He was a troublemaker. He acted out in school, so they took him to a mental health professional to talk about his feelings. Xander wouldn't talk. His behavioral issues got worse with age. He bullied his classmates and was suspended multiple times while at Stella for getting into fights, hiding alcohol, and even sneaking into the girls' hostel. He graduated a year late because of his suspensions. Rumors swirled around Stella that Xander was bad news and his parents should have disciplined him better. I'm not sure that you can blame Monty and Masha, but you tell me, how do you feel about that? Here in the US, we've recently seen a mother of a school shooter being found guilty of manslaughter for not doing her part to keep her son from committing such a heinous crime. So weigh in with your thoughts in the comments. I'm torn because we can't always control someone else's actions, and at this point, Xander was an adult. However, nature and nurture do play a part. As a 19-year-old, Xander was paid by local farmers to hunt and kill wild animals like jackals that killed their cattle. Xander loved to hunt. He loved guns. This was small-town Northwest. It was the culture there. But he'd killed before. Had he graduated to humans? Now that was the question. Investigators talked to the families. Charnel's parents, Ronnie and Anna, said they were concerned about Xander from the start. He seemed like a nice, quiet boy, but he had been suspended, and they heard he was quite the player. So they warned Charnel not to date him, but Charnel always gave people a chance. Stefanis told police that Marna had told him Charnel and Xander were in an abusive relationship. Her words were that Xander wouldn't let Charnel post pictures on Instagram. He thought some of the things she wore were too attractive, and he would even delete certain photos from her phone. He didn't even want her to wear makeup. She had to quit sports, and he tried to feed her sweets so that she would gain weight because, in his mind, he thought it would make her less attractive. If her self-esteem decreased, she would rely on him more, and he'd have more power. Things escalated. People at school saw Xander grab Charnel's arm, push her, and even cause bruising. Charnel told Marna that Xander was aggressive and scary. She waited until the winter of 2018 to break up with him because she was waiting for Xander to graduate so that she didn't have to see him every day. People close to Charnel said that she didn't think Xander was capable of anything drastic like murder, but she knew he was capable of violence, and she didn't want him to have any more power over her life. Investigators waited for DNA results to come back. In June of 2018, a joint funeral service was held at a Dutch Reformed church in Freiburg. Hundreds of people showed up to celebrate Marna and Charnel's friendship and their memory. The girls were buried near each other, and blue, pink, and purple balloons were released into the sky. This tradition represents letting go of grief, letting their souls ascend to the heavens, and letting their spirits be free. Ron told reporters that Charnel was his sunbeam. She was his reason to live. Now that she was gone, his life had lost meaning. He hoped that he could meet her in heaven one day. He didn't want May 25th to be the last time he heard Charnel laugh. I feel so bad for parents who lose their children. At the funeral, the common theory swirling around was that Xander had snuck into the girls' room while they slept, knocked them both out, and then ended their lives. But the autopsy results said something different. Everyone hoped that the girls hadn't seen it coming, but if only they knew the truth. Laurie Mari said she thought it was murder from the beginning. She remembered Xander's obsession with Charnel and thought Xander was the murderer. But why then would Laurie call Xander at 7 o'clock that morning, the morning of her cousin's death? Was she accusing him, or was she informing him? We'll never know what happened during that call, but we do know that the family thought Xander did it. But unbelievably, the general public did not remember. Detective Saunders had not released Xander's original confession. There was just the police statement, which provided only circumstantial evidence but no concrete evidence. Nothing tied him to the crime scene. Then the DNA results came back and they were inconclusive. And I swear when they need the DNA results the most, they always do. But they're inconclusive. There's no other evidence tying him. So they needed it so badly. Xander was not ruled out as a suspect, though he was also not incriminated. The crime scene was covered in DNA. There were so many people who went back and forth in the school. Several samples were found on the rope, the purse, the stairwell, and their bedroom. Everything had been touched by the girls who lived at that facility. There was so much evidence that it was impossible to isolate one DNA strand from the rest. They determined that the strap used to hurt Marna had not been touched by anyone in her family, and the rope used to hurt Charnel had been touched by paramedics and her uncle Louis. Charnel's body had been touched by her dad Ronnie, and as we know, this could have disturbed or covered some of the DNA evidence. Analysts also checked Charnel's fingernails and found her own DNA, as well as DNA they assumed might have belonged to Brandon. She had been touching Brandon's back earlier. If you'll recall, she was helping get rid of some of his back knee. It was highly unlikely that she scratched the person who killed her, since she was taken by surprise. Xander's DNA was the only DNA that was tested against all of the crime scene swabs. Ronnie, Louis, and Brandon were all close enough to Charnel to be of interest, but their DNA would have already been on scene. They didn't have a motive, so they were not suspects. But now the investigators were back at square one, only relying on Xander's confession, which he had taken back. Xander had actually gotten a lawyer, Faye Farion, and he told Farion that he was not anywhere near Stella on Friday night or Saturday morning. However, he claimed he had been threatened by both Chris Saunders and Stephanos, who would kill his parents if he didn't confess to both murders. That was his argument. His lawyer asked why a witness had seen Xander's car near the hostel that night, and Xander again changed his story, a common theme here. He said he had gone to visit Charnel briefly but hadn't even gotten out of his car. He was just dropping off some of her clothes. Xander promised they wouldn't find any of his fingerprints or DNA at the crime scene, so his lawyer gave Xander the benefit of the doubt. But what was unfortunate was that Xander kept telling different stories. He signed Xander up for a mental health assessment. At Xander's next hearing with the Freiburg Magistrates Court, he and his defense decided to plead not guilty to both murders, meaning he would have to be indicted and go to trial. Xander took back his original police confession for several reasons. First, when Laurie Mari called Xander and said Charnel and Marna were dead, he took a handful of anti-anxiety medication. He didn't specify how many pills, but he did say about 10 times his normal dose. Was he trying to cope with his grief? Was he anxious because he had murdered Charnel? Or was he trying to end his own life? Was this even true? We do know he was acting intoxicated when Stephanos arrived at Monty's farm. He said that Xander looked intoxicated when he showed up. He asked why Xander looked intoxicated. So now what his defense was saying is that Saunders took advantage of Xander's vulnerable state and questioned him the entire drive to the station. The second reason Xander took back his confession is that he said it was a false confession. He claimed Saunders intimidated him on the car ride over, and the questioning went on and on. The only way to make it stop was to confess. So, in his drug-induced state of mind, Xander said he didn't see any way out, so that's when he confessed and told Saunders exactly what he wanted him to say. Xander accused Saunders of a crime. Judge Ronald Hendricks hadn't known any of this, so he asked Chris Saunders if he had used any threatening tactics to force Xander to make a confession. This resulted in a trial against Saunders, but luckily Saunders had recorded the entire conversation, so Xander dug his own grave. Detective Saunders had never intended to show the judge or anyone the original conversation between him and Xander, but now that Xander falsely accused him, the recording could be used against him. So now, at Saunders' trial, Colonel Coughlin and Colonel Longa, the two cops who had taken Xander's confession at the station, testified that Xander confessed after talking to Saunders and waived his right to an attorney. Saunders' defense showed the judge the audio recording of their conversation, and that's when the judge noticed that the private investigator was using the Reed technique of interrogation, which wasn't the wisest method. In the recording, you can hear Saunders ask Xander repeatedly whether he's on drugs, and Xander repeatedly said he was just in shock. In the recording, Xander talks about hitting Marna and Charnel to catch them off guard. The judge knew there was no way Xander could have known the autopsy results before they came back. Judge Hendricks decided to exonerate Chris Saunders, and this was evidence that Xander knew much more than he should have. In preparation for Xander's trial, the prosecution put together a timeline. The last time Brandon and Charnel texted was around 1 a.m., and in Xander's confession, he said he showed up at 2 a.m. and he and Charnel talked. We don't know how long they talked, but we do know that Charnel sent a message at 3:42 a.m. to Ronnie, and 2 messages at 4:17 a.m. that said she was sorry. Xander still claimed he didn't send these text messages. If he did, it would imply these murders were not a crime of passion. If he wanted to stay out of jail, he couldn't admit any attempts to cover up his crime, but it was obvious some, if not all, of these texts were sent by the perpetrator. There are 2 scenarios, and I'm going to let you decide which one you think happened. The first scenario is that Xander and Charnel talked on the stairs, and Xander demanded to know her phone password. At 3:40, Xander was going through her phone in front of her and found that picture that, in his mind, he thought was disgusting. He decided to send it to her dad. Charnel was upset, so she went upstairs to change, which gave Xander 30 minutes to murder both Marna and Charnel. Then, at 4:17, he sent 2 fake text messages implying the friends had taken their own lives. He was back at his mom's farm at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he might have seen the Volvo on his way home. The other scenario is that Xander had the conversation, killed Marna, and then Charnel, and spent half an hour between 3:40 and 4:17 a.m. going through Charnel's phone. Prosecutors assumed the second scenario was the most accurate timeline. Xander could have gotten Charnel's password before he killed her, or already known it. The picture of Charnel in her bra didn't seem like an accident. He had a motive to send Ronnie that picture. It was to shame her. Xander told Saunders during their initial conversation that he didn't like when Charnel took pictures of herself. If he wanted to ruin Charnel's image in her dad's mind, it would make sense that he sent it after she died. In most cases, a father is not going to look at this innocent selfie and be ashamed of their child, but in Xander's twisted mind, it was shameful for women to flaunt their beauty in their bodies. Maybe he wanted to tarnish her memory, implicate Brandon in the crime, or create an excuse for why Charnel had taken her own life because she was embarrassed. In any case, Xander killed Charnel and Marna between the hours of 2 o'clock and 4:20 a.m., and if the second scenario was true, Xander sent all of the messages. It shows he was arrogant, and this wasn't a crime of passion. He spent 30 whole minutes sitting in the middle of a crime scene, scrolling to find every last secret. As for Marna, she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was loyal and stuck up for her best friend, Charnel, no matter what, and Xander thought that was worth murder. Xander's lawyers quit due to a conflict of interest, and Xander got a new lawyer named Muman Vessels. While Xander was waiting for his trial, he was allegedly jumped in prison, so he applied for a bail hearing. And you're going to want to hear this. The prosecution came out fighting. They brought forward a letter that Xander had written to his mom while he was in jail. In that letter, he asked his mother to find 2 judges that she thought were corrupt enough that they could pay them off and make sure his bail application would go through. He said if she didn't help him get out of jail, he would take his own life. Wow, talk about emotional manipulation with your own mother. We know he did this with Charnel as well, threatening to hurt himself. Xander confessed that if he got out of jail with the help of his mother, he would escape to Botswana and stay there for 5 years until no one was looking for him anymore. Then he wrote, "I wish that for once you would just read my letter and do exactly as I say. Just be a mother for once in your life and help me." Xander sent that letter not knowing that letters sent from jail are public record. Everyone has access. I've run into a lot of cases where criminals don't know this. Now you know, nothing in jail is private, no conversations, phone calls, letters, nothing. At the hearing, a psychiatrist testified that Xander had paranoid personality disorder. He was depressive, reclusive, impulsive, angry, and thought everyone was out to get him. He also believed his existence in the world was much more significant than other people's. He wasn't able to understand people's motives, so he assumed that everyone was stupid and hated him. He relied on manipulation to get what he wanted. This was consistent with what people knew about Xander. He once posted on his WhatsApp status, "You can't trust anyone." I'm sure you know what WhatsApp is. It's run by Facebook, now Meta. It's the most commonly used messaging platform in Europe and parts of Africa, and you can update your status on the app, just like you would on Facebook. Several acquaintances suspected that he was a narcissist, but I think most of us have said, "You can't trust anyone," at some point in our lives. Of course, Xander came to his own defense, and his lawyer decided to quit. He wouldn't say why, but this was only the beginning of Xander's defense attorney journey. He went through them like candy. His dad spent so much money on lawyers for Xander that he had to sell their family farm. I don't always understand people's urge to defend their children at all costs when their children have clearly done something wrong. After the failed bail hearing, Xander said he didn't want bail. He realized that if he was released into the real world, he'd be a danger. People were starting to suspect him. Remember, the public had been on his side, and at this point he was even scared for his own life because who knows, maybe Stefanos would come back and finish the job. Marna and Charnel's family waited over a year for Xander's trial to start. It was held in Matu High Court, and Mafeking State Prosecutor Johan Smith told the story of Xander, a jealous ex-boyfriend who confessed to the murders in front of Detective Saunders and then to the South African police, but took back his statement when he realized he was facing life in prison. Prosecutor Smith came forward with more evidence against Xander. Marcus Fear had studied Xander's phone records, and at 3:26 a.m. Saturday morning, guess where he was? The GPS put him at the high school. They couldn't pinpoint him exactly at Stella, but he was in the area. There aren't that many phone towers in rural South Africa. Xander had not been at the field drinking, and at 5:01 a.m., his phone finally pinged on Camille Fontaine Farm. If he had sent that last text at 4:17, he could have easily left and gotten back to his mom's house if he had sped down the road. Xander's new attorney, Neon Rai, said Detective Saunders had intimidated and fed Xander information for a confession. Xander testified on his own behalf. He told one of his stories about the conversation on the stairs where Charnel left to put on long pants, and he left as soon as he realized she was serious with Brandon. However, Prosecutor Smith pointed out that Detective Saunders wouldn't have told Xander that Charnel was wearing long pants. It was a very specific detail to bring up if you hadn't seen the crime scene or been there. Xander continued his testimony, saying that Saunders took advantage of him in the car, and Xander just gave the answers Saunders was looking for. Then Saunders sat down with the other police and interrogated Xander for hours. Xander said he was nauseous, tired, drunk, and stressed. After hours in an interrogation room, he confessed to what they wanted to hear. While the prosecution brought in the officers who had interviewed Xander, Colonel Coughlin and Colonel Longa, they both said that Chris Saunders wasn't there for Xander's statement. The trial ground to a halt. Neon Rai considered himself Xander's friend, but Xander had lied to him. Due to conflicting interests, this attorney quit as well, and the trial was postponed until May of 2019. At this point, the trial was international news. People didn't understand why it had been postponed. The public was still not on Chris Saunders' side, but they didn't know that he had taped the conversation with Xander. However, the judge knew that, and this is why the court of public opinion can be dangerous. That's why waiting until trial is always best, so all the facts come out. Xander didn't know the judge knew about this recorded confession. At this point, the judge knew Xander was lying. The prosecution just had to provide enough clear evidence of guilt. Additionally, most people thought that Chris Saunders was hired by the family's private investigator. Remember, he was hired by the school initially, and the public thought the families were biased. They didn't like Xander, so it seemed obvious that Saunders was just doing everything to point the finger at an innocent teenager. The public also thought that Saunders was being paid by Stella High School, so his job was to make sure the perpetrator knew Charnel and Marna, so that the school wouldn't get sued for leaving the gates open. Even if the gates had been shut, Charnel and Marna could have let Xander in on their own, or he could have jumped the gate. After all, he had done it before and threatened to do it. This was not the first time he snuck into a girl's hostel. Even if this information was public, law enforcement had tons of circumstantial evidence against him. The actual trial was held in 2019 when Xander was able to finally get another lawyer. The prosecution came forward with their original argument, but this time they included the recorded evidence of Xander's conversation with Saunders in the car. The judge had already heard it. Remember, the reason this was coming in at all was because Xander was the one who accused Saunders of making him confess. Xander did this to himself, and that confession was very convincing. The new defense attorney, Conrad Bester and Saki Nell, said that Xander's other attorneys had resigned because of personal problems, not because Xander had lied to them. They pointed the finger at Brandon. He'd been present on Friday night, and no one had treated him like a suspect. Xander didn't have any DNA or fingerprints at the crime scene, so he couldn't be responsible. Well, Brandon testified for the prosecution. He explained he had been with Marna and Charnel, and that his DNA would be at the crime scene. He loved Charnel and testified that Xander used horrible and disrespectful names for women. Anastasia Visser was another prosecution witness. She went to a different high school but played against Charnel in sports and knew Xander from a fishing trip. She had both of them on WhatsApp and they would text occasionally. For a long time, Charnel complained to her about Xander's obsessive behavior, and Anastasia supported her. Then, Charnel broke up with Xander, and Xander vented with Anastasia over the course of months. Xander and Anastasia texted more and more. They were attracted to one another, and I have to wonder if part of Anastasia's appeal was her nickname, Loy, the same name everyone used for Charnel. The two had a flirtationship, but they lived far from one another, so it never turned into anything serious. At 6 p.m. on Thursday, May 24th, Anastasia was watching her favorite TV show when her phone rang. It was Xander, yelling over the phone about Charnel and Brandon. He told her if he saw Charnel again, he wouldn't be able to control his anger, and he vowed to drive Charnel so crazy that she would kill herself. Xander also said Charnel took risque photos of herself, and he'd bet she was sending them to Brandon. He told Anastasia he wanted to send them to her dad to show Ronnie how shameful his daughter was. Anastasia tried to de-escalate the situation. She said she didn't think Xander was serious about any of it, and hated being caught in the middle of his relationship with Charnel. Anastasia didn't tell anyone about this call, not even Charnel, not the police, not her parents. But 2 days later, when she watched the news, Anastasia was overcome with guilt. She told her parents about Xander's call, and her parents convinced her to go to the police. The defense said Anastasia was lying, that she had a history of suspensions at her high school. They said she had called Xander that night and wanted revenge against Xander because they had been in a relationship, and Xander broke up with her because he was still in love with Charnel. It was a big love triangle, according to their defense. Anastasia denied all this, and now, the "I love you, Brandon" message sent from Charnel's phone to Ronnie made sense. It was an act of defamation against Charnel while Xander was venting his anger at her relationship with Brandon. How could Anastasia have known that Xander sent a message from Charnel's phone? This also narrowed down the timeline for when Xander had found out about Charnel and Brandon. It must have been that week. It gave him a clear motive. Once again, Xander testified on his own behalf. He had a whole new story. What a surprise. He said Charnel met him at midnight, literally when she would have been hanging out with Marna and Brandon. He didn't get out of his car, but Charnel came through the gate and met him. She sat in his passenger seat and they had a long conversation. According to him, Charnel told Xander that she wanted to be with him, but Marna wouldn't let her. Brandon was just a ruse and a distraction for her. Xander said he wanted to be with Charnel and leave Brandon in the dust, but Charnel said Marna wouldn't approve. She told him to take it up with Marna. He said he left and got home at 4 to see the Volvo truck. Xander said the prosecution really needed to look into Brandon. Xander was innocent, and it must have been the other guy. This was the first time Xander had pointed the finger at Brandon in all of his statements. Why? I have a guess. Xander thought Brandon hadn't heard that conversation with Charnel over the phone. Remember how he called her, and Charnel said she was alone but pretended to walk out of the room, keeping it on speaker? Xander didn't know that Brandon had heard his threat. He only saw Brandon's concerned text to Charnel from 1 o'clock in the morning when he looked through her phone. There's a possibility that Stefanis mentioned Brandon when he came over to threaten Monty and Xander with a gun, but Xander didn't realize Brandon was such a threat to the story until just before the second trial, when he got his 4th set of lawyers. Brandon was the only person that Xander could reasonably pin the murder on, but Xander wasn't as smart as he thought he was. That's a common theme with people like this. They always think they're smarter than everyone else. As for Xander's alibi, the Volvo truck, the defense sent an email to the transportation company that Mara worked for. They asked the truck driver to testify in court. Since the prosecution proved that Xander's phone pinged at 3:50 in Stella, they wanted to know if anyone had seen Xander at 4A at Camille Fontaine Farm. But the truck driver never showed up, and the trucking company never replied. The prosecution asked Xander 2 questions. Did Mara have access to the trucking company email, and did she have access to change the data on each truck? Xander said, I don't know. Had Xander's mom Mara known that Xander was at Stella and sent a truck at 4 Meadow create an alibi, or could she have just changed the time the truck left in the system? Was this truck driver even a real person? Had Xander seen the Volvo, assumed it was his mom's company's truck, and made up a story? If the answer was yes to any of these questions, Mara might have assisted her son in covering up this murder. This was not a surprise. Xander had his mom in his back pocket. She loved her son and would never think anything bad about him. Remember the end-of-the-year prom event when Xander bought Charnel a dress? Well, Mara was the one who supported that idea. Xander even told his mom he didn't like when Charnel wore makeup because he thought women looked bad with makeup. Mara convinced him that makeup wasn't a bad thing, but she promised to do tasteful makeup on Charnel. She never thought that Xander dressing Charnel was controlling behavior, but he was manipulating her all along. Makeup might seem like a silly example, but for Xander, it was one domino in a long chain of abuse and control, even if it was micro in nature. Finally, the prosecution asked Xander why he kept changing his story every time he took the stand. He had a new story each time, and Xander said it was the fault of his old lawyers. You know, the ones who quit. He said whatever his lawyers wanted him to say, but he was the one who changed his plea to not guilty. At this point, Xander doesn't have an alibi, he doesn't have a solid story, but what he does have is a ticket to jail. On February 17, 2020, Judge Hendricks said that Xander was a liar and a manipulator. He killed Marna while she was innocently washing her hands, and then targeted Charnel. This was premeditated. He wanted to end their lives. The motive was jealousy and anger that Charnel had moved on to a new relationship with Brandon, and Marna had supported her. When Xander learned that Charnel wasn't under his thumb and would never get back with him, he decided she would never get with anyone else ever again. Even though it was Xander's first criminal offense, he was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, as he should have been. After the verdict, both Marna and Charnel's family were exhausted. Ed, Marna's mom, had barely spoken to the media in the 2 years since her daughter's murder, but she held it together. She always said, "Oh, I'm fine." She was stubborn and strong-willed, just like Marna, and she was relieved that there would be justice. But it wasn't over yet. They would have to wait until August for sentencing, because COVID hit and everything got postponed. After the verdict, Monty was outraged. He had spent so much money for his son to be sent to jail. He stormed outside and slapped Marcus Fear, the head investigator, across the face. "Wow, maybe we can see where some of the violence and anger issues came from." He slapped him so hard that Officer Fire fell back in his chair. Monty said he would come for Chris Saunders next. In the months following this, Judge Hendrick learned that Xander threatened to resolve this issue with Stephanos and Marna with a gun. I mean, he was going to find out eventually, and the judge was shocked. If his mind wasn't already made up, it was now. I do not think there's a jury involved in these cases, as far as I could tell. South Africa had a lot of non-jury cases. But on August 7th, people flooded into the courtroom. Ronnie and Stephanos sat next to each other, just like they had in every single hearing. Stephanos brought a giant photo of Marna and placed it on the back wall so she could watch over the entire courtroom. Stephanos brought it to remind Xander of what he had taken from the two families. Sonia was drained emotionally. She cared more about Charnel than anyone else in her life, and now she felt numb to the world. It was like Charnel took away the positivity, the bubbly energy with her. Marna's mom was the only one who had not been able to face all of the hearings and court appearances. She was shattered and tired of facing Xander. I get it, none of this would bring her daughter back. The judge gave Xander 2 life sentences. He will also be unfit to possess a gun for the rest of his life. But where and when would he need to possess one? I don't know. Judge Hendrick said in his speech, "There is a huge outcry by society. The gender-based violence which engulfs our society needs to be stopped. The violence perpetrated by men against their women counterparts needs to end. The only way this can be stopped is to impose harsher sentences." 2 life sentences was the harshest sentence he could deliver. Ronnie and Stephanos gasped and threw their hands in the air. It was finally over. Monty and Mara were furious. They hugged onto their son. They were still convinced he never committed this crime. Xander tried to appeal his sentence and failed. He requested new attorneys, which I think is ridiculous. He had his chance. He asked that the truck driver be summoned to testify, which I also think is ridiculous. Do you think the truck driver is his mom? I'm not 100% sure, but the thought crossed my mind. I think there's something fishy about that. He also asked why they never tested Brandon's DNA. But Xander's first 4 defense attorneys didn't request Brandon's DNA. There was not enough evidence for Brandon to ever be a suspect. Charnel and Marna had their entire lives ahead of them. They'll never get married, have children, or have careers. Charnel will never become a successful photographer, and hundreds of animals will never receive Marna's care. But at least Xander will rot in prison. In 2022, the president of South Africa said that ending gender-based violence is the country's #1 priority. This case and so many others could have ended differently if one man weren't on a power trip and actually respected the word no. Xander didn't love Charnel. He wanted power over her, and he couldn't have her, so no one else could.